When the glazier reached a door set between a narrow, overhanging frontage and a small dusty window that displayed nothing at all, he stopped, selected the largest key on his ring, and fitted it into the lock. The bolt slid back with a sound that was heavy and damp, not a sharp click, but a muted thud that spoke of old wood and candle wax, and the weight of an iron mechanism that had been in place since the reign of the previous king. He pushed the door inward, and it opened onto a rectangle of deeper darkness that smelled of linseed oil, tallow, lampblack, and the mineral coolness of cut stone. The glazier stepped inside, set his satchel on the flagstones near the threshold, and took a deep breath that was entirely unconscious, the way a man breathes when he enters a familiar space that carries the scent of his daily work. He did not light a lantern immediately. He let the faint grey light from the doorframe seep across the room and show him the shapes of his tools and materials arranged in the same places where he had left them the evening before. The workshop occupied the ground floor of the building, a long, low room that ran back from the street to a small walled yard where a lean-to roof covered the racks of raw glass. The ceiling beams were low enough that the glazier could touch them with his outstretched fingers, and the plaster between the timbers had cracked in long, wandering lines that nobody had bothered to fill. On the street side was a wooden counter where customers would stand, and behind the counter the space opened into the glazier's working area, a large central bench made of elm, stained dark by decades of oil and iron filings, a smaller side bench for cutting, and a row of shelves built into the wall that held clay pots, rolls of lead line, bundles of flax string, and wooden boxes whose contents were known only by the shapes of the lids. Along the back wall, under the lean-to's shelter, sheets of glass were stacked upright in narrow wooden grooves, resting on a bed of clean straw that rustled when a draft moved through. The floor was a patchwork of stone and beaten earth, strewn with a fine grit that crunched under the soles of leather shoes and collected in the corners in soft grey drifts that the glazier's apprentice swept out every second Saturday. Though the apprentice was not yet present, he would arrive after the bells of St. Sati. Michael's rang for terse, a silent agreement between master and boy that had never been spoken aloud. For now the workshop was entirely still, a state that the glazier acknowledged by standing motionless for a long moment just inside the door, his hands resting at his sides, his eyes moving slowly across the shapes of the room. You could imagine him there, in that half-dark, watching the way the incoming light slowly separated the iron tongs from the cutting gauge and the cutting gauge from the grozing pliers, until the outline of every tool became distinct, and the surface of the elm bench began to glow with a dull, amber-tinged reflection borrowed from the sky. The dust that hung in the air turned into a fine, suspended haze, visible only where the light cut across it in a sloping column that ended at the base of the glass rack. Nothing in the room moved except that dust, drifting in a slow, continuous stir that never settled and never rushed. A kind of silent, permanent weather inside the workshop. The glazier then reached for the lantern that hung from a hook on one of the ceiling beams, a lantern of pierced tin with a small horn window, and he took a tinderbox from the shelf beneath the counter, a small, worn brass box that contained the flint, the steel, and the charred linen that would catch the spark. He opened it without looking, his fingers going to the familiar grooves, and he struck the steel against the flint in a motion so practiced that the spark leaped onto the linen on the first attempt. He blew gently on the glowing edge of the cloth, encouraging the small ember to become a flame, and then he touched the flame to the wick of the lantern. The wick caught, giving off the warm animal smell of burning tallow and the soft yellow light that pushed back the grey shadows and gave the workshop its true colours. The elm bench was a deep, rich honey brown, streaked with darker grain lines. The glass sheets in the back were a pale green that turned to an almost white transparency where the light passed through them. The iron tools resting on their pegs and hooks were a uniform black-brown patina, flecked with drop of what-worneths will dry in rather than dry after the could I have to get of course. He adjusted the wick so the flame steadied without smoking, then hung the lantern on its hook and began his morning inspection, which was as much a habit as a necessity, a quiet ritual that marked the start of the working day. He walked to the main bench first and placed his palms flat on the surface, testing for moisture that might have seeped up from the ground overnight. The wood was dry and cool, slightly tacky in one spot where a residue of linseed oil had never fully cured. He checked the alignment of the wooden layout pegs, small cylinders of turned oak that he used to hold glass pieces in place when assembling a panel, and he found them all resting in their shallow holes along the bench's edge, exactly as he had left them. Next he moved to the side bench where the cutting tools lay in a leather roll, and he unrolled it with a gentle, even pull, revealing the tempered iron cutting wheel, the handled grazing pliers with their notched jaws, and the heavy straight edge made of a dense, dark wood that had once been part of a broken tally stick. Each tool was in its proper slot, each one wiped clean of the white chalky dust that clung to everything after a day of cutting glass. The grazing pliers were slightly open, resting at the angle that kept their spring from tightening, a small point of care that the glazier noted and approved. After the tools, he turned his attention to the lead strips coiled on a large wooden spool mounted to the wall, a spool that turned on an iron axle with a low, satisfying creak whenever he pulled a length free. The lead came, the H-section channel that would hold the edges of the glass, hung in long, kinked ribbons from the spool to the floor, and there were several different widths, each assigned to a particular thickness of glass. The glazier ran his thumb along the edge of the widest came, feeling for burrs or rough spots that might catch on the glass later, but the lead was smooth and ready, still carrying the faint metallic odor of the casting mill where it had been formed 2 weeks before. Beside the lead spool stood the box of solder wire, its dull grey coils looking heavy and soft, and next to that the clay pot of tallow flux that was covered with a piece of oiled cloth, kept moist and clean. These things required no adjustment, so the glazier simply let his gaze rest on them for a breath or two, recognizing their presence as a cook might inventory the contents of a larder before beginning the day's meal. The inspection continued to the back of the room, where the glass sheets waited in their rack under the lean-to. The first light of proper dawn was now filtering through the small, cloudy windows set high in the back wall, and it fell across the stacked glass in a soft, diffuse wash that made the sheets appear almost luminous, their edges glowing a pale, muted blue-green like the underside of an ice floe. The glazier stood before the rack and let his eyes travel from the topmost sheet to the bottom, counting the colors without speaking. There were 4 full sheets of the common forest glass, a green so pale it was nearly water when held up to the sky, 3 sheets of a deeper amber that shaded to honey at the thinnest spots, 2 small sheets of a rich, streaky ruby that had been imported from Normandy at great cost and used sparingly, only for small border accents, a single sheet of a soft, quasby blue breast that snuck. All the glass was thick and uneven, rippled with waves and air bubbles, and the swirls of imperfect mixing that gave each pane a life of its own when the light passed through it. The glazier noted that the ruby sheet had a fresh crack near one corner, probably from the damp air contracting during the night, but the crack was in a part of the glass that would be cut away and discarded when he began his project, so the observation brought no concern, only a soft, silent note filed away in his mind. By the time he had completed his slow circuit of the workshop, the light outside had strengthened enough to cast a pale, watery shadow on the floor in front of the oaken door. The street beyond had also begun to wake. A cart rumbled past on the way to the market, its wooden wheels making a sound like the low rolling of thunder. The voice of a woman calling to a child echoed and then faded. The city's bells from various parishes began to mark the hour, with a series of muffled chimes that overlapped in a comfortable, familiar pattern. The glazier stood in the center of the workshop and listened to these sounds without needing to identify them, letting them wash over him as he decided, without hurry, that today he would begin laying out the design for the new window at St. Live. Michael, the belfry, a plain panel of diamond quarries and narrow border fillets in amber and green, and a few touches of the pale blue, with no figures, no emblems, no inscriptions, nothing but a quiet assembly of light and lead. A window that would simply fill a stone tracery with color and admit the morning sun into the nave. He had already taken the measurements with his knotted string the day before, and the figures were written in chalk on a slate that leaned against the wall. The work would be steady and repetitive, the kind of work that moved forward in small, measurable increments, and it would occupy him and his apprentice for the next fortnight if the weather held and the glass did not crack too often under the cutter. He felt no urgency about this timeline. The churchwardens had told him the window had been open to the air for 6 months already, and another 2 weeks would make no difference to the stone, or the parish, or the quiet, uncertain turn of the year. He walked back to the counter where his satchel still rested on the floor, and he lifted it onto the countertop, unfastening the brass clasp and removing the folded paper that contained his order notes and the small smudged sketch the wardens had approved. The paper was thick and rough, with deckled edges that had been trimmed by hand, and the sketch showed a simple grid of diamond shapes arranged in alternating rows, a pattern so old that it had no name beyond quarries, a design that had been set into the windows of English churches for centuries without attracting either praise or complaint. The glazier placed the paper on the counter and weighted its corners with 4 of the layout pegs, smoothing the creases with the side of his hand until the drawing lay flat. He then walked to the back lean-to and selected 3 sheets of glass, 1 amber, 1 pale green, and 1 of the green-tinted clear, that he would carry to the cutting bench, and he did this with the same slow, balanced movements he used for everything, sliding the sheets out of their grooves and holding them against his chest, like large, fragile books, careful not to let the sharp edges bite into the wool of his doublet. He laid the sheets on the cutting bench one at a time, placing them on a bed of folded felt to protect the surfaces from the hard wood, and then he stepped away, letting the day's work wait for a moment longer while he stood still and watched the late spring light begin to find its way into the room. The dust motes swirled gently in the widening column that now reached across the floor to the counter, and somewhere in the minster tower, the great bells tolled a single long note that seemed to hang in the air like a held breath before it slowly dissolved into the ordinary sounds of morning. The glazier listened, and breathed, and was ready. The glazier let the morning settle around him for a short while longer, standing near the cutting bench while the lantern flame burned steady, and the light through the dusty back window grew from pearl grey to the softer, warmer shade of thin milk. He did not hurry towards the door, because part of his craft, perhaps the oldest part, was learning to wait for the right hour to move through the city. He knew that the streets would be filling now with carts and apprentices and the first calls of the vendors, and that if he left too early he would be caught in the press at the top of Stonegate, where the way narrowed before opening onto the square. So he busied himself with small, quiet tasks that needed no thought. He coiled a loose length of lead, came and tucked the end under the spool so it would not kink. He wiped the grazing pliers with a scrap of oiled wool until the metal showed a dull gleam. He tipped the clay pot of tallow flux to check its level and found it sufficient. The morning outside became busier, the voices and wheels and the distant lowing of cattle being moved towards the shambles, threading into one continuous murmur. And when at last the great minster bell rang the 3/4 hour, he decided that the time was right. He removed his apron, which was made of heavy buff leather, and hung it on the peg by the door. He brushed the front of his doublet with his palms, though there was no dust yet, and he took up his broad felt hat from the counter, a hat that had once been brown, but had faded to a warm earthy grey, and he placed it carefully on his head, pulling the brim low over his eyes against the pale spring glare. From a shelf he selected a ball of flax string, a small folded rule made of boxwood, a lump of white chalk tied in a scrap of linen, and a wooden tablet with a smoothed surface that bore the faint ghosts of previous measurements. These he slipped into the satchel along with the folded paper of the order notes, and then he stepped out of the workshop, pulling the door shut behind him and locking it with the largest key, which he returned to its ring with a sound like a single muted note. The morning on Stonegate was exactly as he had expected. The sun had climbed high enough to touch the upper stories of the timbered houses, painting the carved barge boards and the painted plaster in bands of gold and deep shadow. The air smelt of fresh horse dung and bakehouse smoke, and the distant cool breath of the river. Apprentices dodged past him carrying trays of loaves and covered pots, while a woman in a blue kirtle beat a rush mat against the side of her door, sending a cloud of dust and dried lavender into the light. The glazier walked among them without haste, his satchel bumping softly against his hip, his boots finding the dry places between the cobbles. He did not look into the shop windows, though some of them were now being unshuttered by sleepy boys with long hooks. He simply walked forward with the easy rolling gait of a man who knew every hump and hollow of the street. At the bottom of Stonegate he turned left into the wider thoroughfare that led past the minster, and here he paused for a moment, as he often did, to look up at the great central tower that rose above the city in tiers of pale limestone and intricate stonework, its pinnacles catching the fresh light. The tower was enormous and calm, a fixed point that made the shifting clouds behind it seem to move faster. The Glazier did not study it as a tourist might. He merely acknowledged its presence and noted, almost without conscious thought, the condition of the great west window, whose stone tracery held ranks of coloured glass that he had never worked on, but that he had observed, season by season, watching for the telltale bowing of a panel that might indicate the lead was stretching. The window looked sound today, and he moved on, walking along the south side of the minster, where the grass of the close was studded with small white daisies, and a few sheep grazed under the watch of a boy who lay on his back, staring at the sky. The parish church of St. Lard. Michael the belfry stood just a stone's throw from the minster's western front, a smaller, humbler building of the same pale stone, with a square bell tower and a low-pitched roof of lead that gleamed dully. Its churchyard was enclosed by a low wall of dressed stone, and the gate stood open, its wrought-iron latch worn to a bright silver by countless hands. The Glazier pushed the gate just far enough to enter, then closed it behind him, hearing the latch drop into its socket with a soft plink. The path to the porch was made of flat stones worn concave by centuries of footsteps, and between the stones grew small, tight cushions of moss that were still damp from the night. He walked that path, as he walked every other, with an unhurried, even tread, and he entered the south porch, a small dim space with stone benches on either side, and a single empty niche where a small statue had once stood. The niche was bare now, the stone inside it slightly lighter than the surrounding wall, but the Glazier gave it no more than a passing glance. He pushed open the heavy inner door, which was studded with square-headed iron nails, and stepped into the nave. Inside the church, the air was cooler by several degrees, and it held the layered scent of old stone, beeswax candles, dusty woolen hangings, and the faint, clean smell of the rushes that were strewn on the floor near the entrance. The nave was long and narrow, divided into 3 aisles by 2 rows of clustered columns that rose to pointed arches, and the floor was a patchwork of worn flagstones and memorial brasses that glinted dully in the low light. The great east window was filled with pale, clear glass that had been put in after the old coloured glass was removed, so the morning sun poured through it in a wide, diffuse wash that illuminated the chancel steps and the plain wooden altar table with a cool, silvery brightness. Elsewhere, smaller windows held fragments of older work, diamond quarries in faded yellows and greens, a few delicate trefoils, a border of painted vine leaves that had somehow escaped notice. The Glazier's commission, the window in the north aisle, stood open to the air, its stone tracery an empty web of mullions and circles that framed a patch of blue sky and a single drifting cloud. A temporary board had been fitted into the lower portion to keep out birds and weather, but it had warped slightly, leaving a gap through which a ribbon of daylight slipped in and painted a long white stripe across the nave floor. The Glazier stood in the centre aisle and observed all this with a slow, sweeping glance, noting the quality of the light, the direction of the sun, and the way the empty window related to the columns and the distant chancel. After a moment, 2 men emerged from a small door behind the pulpit, a door that led to the vestry where the churchwardens kept their records in the parish chest. They were both dressed with the sober, sturdy neatness of middling tradesmen. One wore a long gown of dark brown wool with a fur collar, the other a short cloak over a black doublet and hose. The man in the gown was Master Heron, a wax chandler with a round, placid face and hands that were always slightly greasy, no matter how often he wiped them on the square of linen tucked into his belt. The other was Goodwife Margaret's husband, a draper named Thomas Byland, who was thinner and taller and had a way of tilting his head slightly to one side when he listened, as if he were trying to catch a distant sound. They approached the Glazier with the quiet footsteps of men who were used to moving through the church without disturbing its peace, and the 3 of them stood together near a cold stone pillar, speaking in low tones that did not carry beyond their small circle. Master Heron began by remarking on the mildness of the morning, a remark that was not a question and required no real answer, and the Glazier nodded in return, shifting his weight so that the satchel rested more evenly on his shoulder. Then Thomas Byland spoke about the window, gesturing towards the empty tracery with a long, pale hand. The window had lost its glass during the great windstorm of the previous autumn, he explained. A storm that had torn through the city and broken branches from the old yew in the churchyard. The lead had failed at several joints, and the whole panel had sagged inward, cracking the central quarries and spilling fragments onto the flagstones below. The sound of the glass shattering, he said, had been like a single, sharp cry that woke his wife from sleep, but by the time they had lit a lantern and come to the church, the damage was done. The wardens had swept up the broken pieces, stored the salvageable border glass in a box in the vestry, and covered the opening with a board, and then they had waited through the winter and the unsettled spring, through the changes in parish practice and the long debates in London that seemed to touch every corner of the kingdom, until they felt it safe and sensible to commission a repair. The glazier listened to this account without interrupting, his eyes moving from the wardens' faces to the empty window and back again. When Byland finished, Master Heron added, in a voice as smooth and steady as the wax he poured into his candle moulds, that the parish could not afford a painted window with images that might be deemed unsuitable for the present temper of the times. What they wanted, what they had discussed with the rector before he rode to his new living in the country, was a panel of simple diamond quarries arranged in a regular grid, framed by a narrow border of amber, and perhaps a touch of blue or pale ruby at the corners. No faces, no symbols, no Latin verses, nothing that could catch the eye of a visitor with strong opinions. Just plain, honest glass that would admit the daylight, keep out the weather, and serve the church in the silent, steady way that stone and timber served it. The work, Heron said, should be completed before the feast of St. Michael if possible. But if it took longer, that was no great matter, so long as the board held. The glazier accepted all this with a slow inclination of his head, a single, fluid nod that conveyed agreement and understanding, and the beginning of a plan. He then asked permission to climb the scaffolding that still remained in place from the winter inspection, a structure of rough-hewn poles and lashed crossbeams that rose from the north aisle floor to the sill of the window. And the wardens told him to take his time, that they would be in the vestry reviewing the parish accounts if he needed them. So the glazier walked to the foot of the scaffolding, set down his satchel on the lowest board, and tested the stability of the structure by grasping one of the upright poles and giving it a gentle shake. The scaffolding was solid, the lashings were tight, the poles had not shifted, and the wooden rungs were dry and free of rot. He climbed slowly, feeling each rung take his weight before he trusted it fully, until he was standing on a broad plank just below the level of the empty tracery. From this elevated spot he could look down and see the entire north aisle, its stone floor dappled with the pale reflections of the east window, and he could also look out through the open tracery at the churchyard and the bit of street beyond, where a cart loaded with sacks of grain was creaking slowly towards the river. But his attention was on the stonework immediately before him. The window was a tall lancet divided into two main lights by a single central mullion, with a small trefoil opening above and two narrow curved spandrels at the sides. The masonry was solid and clean, the edges of the tracery crisp and unchipped, and the groove into which the leaded panel would be set was cut deep and true, about the width of his thumb. The glazier inspected this groove inch by inch, running his fingertips along the cold, slightly gritty stone to feel for obstructions. Old bits of mortar, wedges of ancient lead, the nests of spiders that were now abandoned. But the groove was clear and smooth, ready to receive a new panel. He then retrieved his satchel from below, climbing down and up again with the same deliberate care, and he took out his ball of string and his lump of chalk and his boxwood rule. Standing on the scaffold, he measured the height of the opening first, lowering the string weighted with a small lead plumb bob from the top of the groove to the sill, and when the bob hung perfectly still, he marked the string with a pinch of chalk at the exact point where it touched the lower stone. He measured the width in 3 places, at the base, at the midpoint, and just under the arch, because stone walls, no matter how well built, have a habit of narrowing or spreading by a fraction of an inch after centuries of settling. Each measurement he recorded by tying a small knot in the string at the correct position, a system he had learned as a boy and still trusted more than numbers written on slate. The knot for the width at the base came first, then the knot for the midpoint, then the knot for the top. They lay on the string like tiny, tight seeds on a stalk, and he checked each one twice, holding the string against the stone and squinting sideways to be sure the chalk mark exactly aligned with the edge of the groove. After the main lights, he turned his attention to the trefoil opening above, which required a separate, smaller template. For this, he pressed his wooden tablet against the stone and traced the three-lobed shape with the side of his chalk, smudging the wood with a ghostly white outline that he would later transfer to paper. The spandrels on either side of the arch were next, one left and one right, both irregular, four-sided shapes that curved slightly at the top. He took a fresh piece of string for these and knotted it just as carefully. The entire process of measuring occupied perhaps half an hour, though to anyone watching from the nave it might have seemed longer because there was no visible drama in it, only the slow, patient movement of a man's hands against the stone, the soft whisper of string on fingers, the occasional tap of the boxwood rule against the mullion as he checked his knots against the rule's marked inches. The church itself was very quiet during this time. The warden's voices could be heard faintly from the vestry, a low murmur like bees in a distant hive, and once a woman entered through the south door and knelt briefly in one of the side chapels before rising and slipping out again, her leather soles making small, light sounds on the flags. The glazier paid no attention to these comings and goings. He was absorbed in the simple, absorbing task of transferring the shape of a stone opening into a set of knotted strings and chalk tablets, a process that was as old as glass itself. When at last he was satisfied, he coiled the strings into neat loops and placed them in his satchel with the tablet and the rule, and he descended the scaffolding with the same slow, steady caution, feeling for each rung with the heel of his boot before committing his weight. On the nave floor he dusted his hands on the front of his doublet, leaving faint chalky fingerprints that he did not notice, and he walked back to the vestry door. The wardens turned from an open chest of musty papers and looked at him expectantly. The glazier told them, in a few quiet words, that the tracery was sound and the dimensions were now taken, and that he would begin cutting the glass that very morning, working the quarries to fill the lights and the border pieces to frame them, and that he would use the amber glass for the wide border fillets and the pale green for the main quarries, with a few diamond accents in the blue at the corners of each light, just enough to give the eye a still point of rest. Master Heron nodded, his round face crinkling with a mild, satisfied smile, and Thomas Byland tilted his head and said that this sounded exactly right, that he would inform his wife and the rector's curate. The wardens asked if any payment was needed in advance for the materials, and the glazier replied that he had glass enough in his workshop to begin without new outlay, and a settlement at the Feast of St. Michael would suit him well. The arrangement was thus agreed upon in a few soft, unrecorded sentences, and no contract was drawn because the parties trusted one another and because the sum involved was too small to trouble a lawyer. The glazier then took his leave, stepping once more through the south porch and into the churchyard, where the sun was now fully above the minster tower, and the daisies had opened their white petals wide to the warmth. The rooks were still calling from the elms, and somewhere nearby a bell was being tolled in a slow, steady rhythm for a funeral nobody in his parish had heard about. He walked back through the streets, passing the same shops and the same carts that had been there an hour before. But now the quality of the light had changed from the pale clarity of early morning to the heavier, yellower glow of late forenoon, and the shadows under the eaves had shortened and grown darker at their edges. When he reached his workshop door on Stonegate, he saw that the apprentice, a pale boy of about 14 named Robin, had arrived and was sitting on the stone step with his back against the door, chewing a piece of dry bread and watching a cat wash its face on the opposite window ledge. The boy stood up quickly and touched his cap, and the glazier greeted him with a brief, neutral nod that was neither warm nor cold, but simply familiar, the sort of nod that acknowledged a presence that had been part of the workshop for 2 years now. He unlocked the door, and the two of them went inside, where the lantern was still burning with a soft, steady flame, and the sheets of glass lay on the cutting bench under their cloth of felt. The glazier set his satchel on the counter, uncoiled the strings of measurements, and laid them beside the folded paper with the sketch, and then he stood for a long, quiet moment, looking at the pale green glass that would soon become the main quarries for the windows of St. Michael the Belfry. The boy, sensing that no instructions were coming yet, settled onto his stool by the grozing bench and waited in the patient, alert silence that years of apprenticeship had already begun to teach him. Outside the open door, The sounds of Stonegate continued their endless, untroubled murmur. The glazier stood before the glass rack in the lean-to at the back of the workshop, where the morning light fell through the small, clouded window in a single slanting pane that touched the edges of the stored sheets and made them glow faintly, each one a thin slab of frozen color propped in its wooden groove. The rack itself was a simple construction of oak stiles and rails, assembled with peg joints and braced against the stone wall, its base packed with clean straw that rustled whenever a sheet was lifted or returned. Some of the glass had rested here for months, some for more than a year, waiting in the patient darkness for a commission that would call them into service. The glazier knew each sheet by its position and its peculiar character, the way a scribe might know the individual quirks of the quills in his jar, and this morning he intended to make a careful selection for the window at St. Live. Michael le Belfry, drawing from the rack only those pieces that would suit the scheme of amber borders and green quarries and the small blue corner accents he had described to the wardens. The boy Robin had taken his place on the stool by the grozing bench, and was occupied with cleaning the notched jaws of a pair of old pliers, rubbing them with a scrap of oiled wool in slow, circular motions that made no sound louder than a soft, rhythmic hush. The workshop settled into its working quiet, a quiet that was not empty but filled with small, steady noises and the patient attention of two people who understood that a day's labor began long before the first cut was made. The glazier first drew out the sheet of pale green forest glass that stood at the left end of the rack, the one he had noticed during his morning inspection. He slid it from its groove with both hands, lifting it carefully past the other sheets, and carried it to the main bench, where the light from the street door and the lantern together would show its true quality. The sheet was roughly rectangular, about 14 inches wide and 18 inches tall, a size that had been determined by the glassmaker's blowing rod and the strength of his lungs rather than by any plan, and its thickness varied from a heavy rippled edge near the bottom to a thinner, smoother crown near the top, where the blowpipe had been broken away. The glazier set the sheet on the padded felt and tilted it towards the light, observing how the pale green color shifted and deepened in the thicker areas, becoming almost an olive shadow where the glass had folded slightly during blowing, then rising to a clear, watery transparency in the thinner spots where the blower's shears had trimmed the edge. Bubbles were caught inside the glass like tiny, elongated tears, some arranged in faint spirals that recorded the twist of the blowpipe. These bubbles were not flaws but features. They scattered the light in a soft, diffuse manner that gave the glass its gentle, living quality, and they had been there since the moment the glass had cooled from its molten state in a Normandy furnace 2 summers past. The glazier ran his thumb lightly around the edge of the sheet, testing for sharp flanges or hairline cracks that might have spread since he last handled it, but the edge was sound except for one small, shallow nick near the lower left corner that he noted and dismissed. The nick was in a portion that would be trimmed away when he cut the quarries. Satisfied, he set the sheet flat on the bench and returned to the rack for the next. The second sheet was one of the pale amber pieces, a color that came from adding a small measure of iron oxide to the sand and ash mixture, and it had been made by a different glass house, one located in the Weald of Sussex, where the local beechwood produced a hotter, cleaner flame. This sheet was slightly thinner than the green one, and more even in its thickness, though it had its own character. A faint, cloudy streak ran across the middle like a ribbon of honey dropped into clear water, and at the top edge the glass had been stamped with a small round mark from the glassmaker's seal, a circle with 3 dots that had been pressed into the cooling surface while it was still soft. The glazier held this sheet up to the light and watched how the amber color warmed the daylight, turning it into a rich, golden glow that reminded him, in a way he did not put into words, of autumn afternoons, when the low sun caught the leaves of the elms near the city walls. He decided that this sheet would provide the border fillets for the upper portion of the window, where the light was strongest, and the gold would frame the green quarries with a subdued, quiet richness. He placed the amber sheet on the bench beside the green, leaving a small gap between them so their edges would not meet and chip, and he turned back to the rack once more. The next selection was more particular, the soft blue glass that he had promised to use at the corners of each light, a small accent that would give the eye a place to rest amid the green and amber. This blue glass was not English, but had been imported from the continent, brought across the channel in a crate packed with straw and sand that had taken 3 weeks to reach York by way of London and the Great North Road. The sheet was smaller than the others, perhaps 10 inches square, and its colour was the pale hazy blue of woodland smoke or the sky on a misty April morning. It had been made with beechwood ash and a tiny amount of cobalt, enough to tint the glass without darkening it, and its surface was rippled all over with fine, parallel waves that caught the light in shifting ribbons as the glazier turned it in his hands. He noted that this sheet was particularly prone to cracking if cut too quickly. The waves indicated an uneven cooling that had set stresses into the glass, and he would need to score it slowly and tap it with extra gentleness when the time came. He set the blue sheet on the bench apart from the others, then went back and selected a second sheet of pale green, because the church window was tall, and the first green sheet would not yield enough quarries for the entire light. This second green sheet was the mate of the first, from the same batch and the same furnace, and it bore the same characteristic bubbles and the same soft watery hue, though it was a fraction narrower, a difference he would accommodate by adjusting the layout of the diamond grid. The streaky ruby glass he looked at for a long while without lifting it from the rack. The 2 sheets of ruby were smaller and costlier than anything else he kept, a deep dark red that shaded in places to a warmer vermilion and in other places to a cooler, almost purplish crimson where the colour had pooled during cooling. He had used a corner of one sheet 3 months prior for a small heraldic panel in a merchant's private chapel, the sort of discreet, non-religious work that was still acceptable, and the remaining portions were irregular in shape, like the outline of a coast on a map. He considered adding a few tiny ruby diamonds at the very center of each border section, but after a moment of still, silent thought, he decided against it. The wardens had asked for simplicity, and the blue accents were enough. The ruby was too vivid, too noticeable, and it might draw the kind of attention that a quiet parish window did not need. He left the ruby sheets where they stood, their edges catching the light in a deep, garnet spark that he acknowledged and then ignored. With the glass sheets now gathered on the main bench, 2 pale greens, 1 amber, and the small soft blue, the glazier stepped back and surveyed the arrangement as a painter might survey a palette. The colours lay on the dark, oil-stained elm like fallen leaves on a forest floor, each one distinct and quiet, and together they promised a window that would be harmonious and unremarkable. Exactly the kind of window that would be harmonious and unremarkable. Exactly the kind of window that would satisfy the wardens and serve the parish and raise no questions from anyone who visited St. Michael Belfry on a Sunday morning. The glazier then did something that was part of his own private rhythm. He placed his right hand flat on the surface of each sheet in turn, feeling the cool smoothness through his palm and fingers, a gesture that was neither practical nor superstitious, but simply a way of greeting the material before he began to alter it. The glass was cold and dry, with a texture like polished soap, and it carried a faint, mineral smell that clung to the skin after he lifted his hand away. At this point the boy Robin, who had been watching from his stool with the quiet attentiveness that apprentices learn or else do not last, set down the pliers and the oiled wool and approached the main bench. He did not speak. He simply stood at a respectful distance and waited for the glazier to acknowledge him. After a moment the glazier glanced up and inclined his head slightly, which was permission to come closer, and the boy stepped forward and studied the 4 sheets of glass with the serious, slightly squinting gaze of someone who was still learning to see what his master saw. The glazier pointed to the pale green sheets and told the boy, in a low, even voice, that these would become the diamond quarries for the main lights, and then he pointed to the amber sheet and said it would yield the border fillets, those long, narrow rectangles that ran around the edge of a panel like a picture frame. The blue sheet, he said, would serve for the small diamond accents of the corners, and only the corners. A little blue went a long way, and too much would upset the balance of the window. The boy listened without interrupting, nodding once when the explanation was done, and then he returned to his stool and resumed cleaning the grozing pliers with the same slow, circular motion, though now he glanced up occasionally to watch the glazier's next movements. The glazier next fetched a clean linen cloth from a shelf, a cloth that had been washed in lye and dried in the sun until it was stiff and pale, and he used it to wipe the surface of each glass sheet, removing the fine invisible film of grit that always settled on stored glass no matter how carefully the rack was covered. He wiped in long, steady strokes, pressing just firmly enough to catch the dust without scratching the surface, and when the cloth came away it left the glass so clean that the lantern flame reflected in it like a small, captive sun. Any speck of dirt left on the glass, he had told the boy many times, could cause the cutting iron to skip or the lead to seat imperfectly later, and a window that leaked or cracked after a year was a window that had been made in haste. So he wiped each sheet until it met his silent standard of cleanness, and then he folded the cloth and laid it aside, where it would be ready for the next round of wiping after the cutting began. With the glass clean and the selection complete, the glazier turned his attention to the chalked template he would use to lay out the diamond quarry shapes. This template was a thin piece of slate with a diamond cut out of its center, a diamond measuring 3 inches across the widest point and 4.5 inches from tip to tip, the proportion that had been used for parish windows in the north of England for as long as anyone could remember. The slate was darkened with handling and had a small chip at one corner that did not affect its use. The glazier placed the template on the pale green sheet nearest him, positioning it so that the diamond shape aligned with the grain of the glass, and he marked the outline with a lump of white chalk, drawing the 4 sides in slow, careful strokes that met at neat, precise points. He did not mark a single quarry. He marked a whole row of them, sliding the template across the glass by increments and using a wooden straightedge to keep the alignment true, until the green sheet was covered with a grid of overlapping diamond outlines that looked like a pattern of frost on a cold window pane. The chalk lines were pale and would smudge if handled roughly, so he worked around them with care, leaning over the bench and moving his arms in slow, deliberate arcs that left the lines undisturbed. When one green sheet was fully marked, he moved to the second and repeated the process. Then he marked the amber sheet with narrower rectangles for the border fillets, and finally he marked the blue sheet with a half-dozen small diamonds that would be cut and set aside for the corners. The entire marking process was quiet and repetitive, the only sounds being the soft drag of chalk on glass and the occasional clink of the slate template being set down on the elm bench. And the afternoon outside the workshop continued its own slow progress towards evening without any interruption. By the time the glazier set down the chalk and straightened his back, the quality of the light in the workshop had begun to change from the bright, clear illumination of mid-morning to the deeper, yellower light of early afternoon. The lantern still burned on its hook, but its flame was now pale and thin against the stronger daylight, and the dust in the air had shifted its angle as the sun moved across the sky beyond the high back window. The boy Robin had finished his cleaning task and was now dozing lightly on his stool, his head drooping forward and his hands loose in his lap, a posture the glazier allowed because the boy had been up since before dawn carrying water to his mother's house in the parish of St. Denis. The glazier did not wake him. Instead, he covered the marked sheets of glass with a protective felt cloth, tucking the edges under the corners of the glass so that no passing draught could lift it, and he walked to the front door of the workshop and stood in the threshold for a while, watching the street. Stonegate was drowsy in the midday warmth. The high sun had driven the vendors back under their awnings and the shoppers into the cooler alleys, and the only person visible was a man in a dusty jerkin leading a donkey loaded with firewood, the animal's hooves making a slow, steady clopping that faded gradually into the distance. The glazier breathed the outdoor air, which was warmer now, and carried the smell of the midden heaps from the shambles and the sweeter scent of the flowering gorse that grew on the city walls, and he thought in a loose, unstructured way about the work ahead. The cutting of the quarries tomorrow, the grozing of their edges, the laying out of the cartoon, the bending of the lead cames. Each step was separate and straightforward, and none of them required haste. They would unfold in their natural order like the hours of the monastic offices, each one giving way to the next without strain or hurry. After a minute or two, he turned back into the workshop, where the lantern flame gave a small, sudden flutter as the door swung closed, and he began the final task of the afternoon, which was to measure the length of lead, cane he would need for the borders, and to uncoil a fresh supply from the spool, enough to frame the amber fillets and the green quarries of the north aisle window. The lead came off the spool with a soft, continuous metallic hiss, and the boy Robin stirred on his stool and opened his eyes, and the glazier worked on in the warm yellow quiet, unhurried and content. The morning that had been set aside for cutting the quarries began in the same unhurried way as every other morning in the glazier's workshop, with the slow lift of light over the rooftops of Stonegate and the gradual warming of the air inside the long, low room. The lantern still burned on its hook, though the glazier had trimmed the wick so the flame was no larger than a bean, because the daylight through the back window and the open front door was now strong enough to work by. The boy Robin had arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small cloth bundle that held his midday meal of bread and hard cheese, and he had swept the beaten earth floor without being asked, using the worn besom broom that leaned in the corner near the lead spool, its birch twigs making a soft, scratchy sound against the packed dirt and flagstones. The glazier had acknowledged this small act of diligence with the same brief level nod he always used, and then he had turned his attention to the glass sheets that lay waiting on the main bench under their cover of felt, their surfaces marked all over with the white chalk outlines of the diamond quarries, and the long border fillets. Today the chalk marks would become cuts, and the cuts would become pieces, and the pieces would be sorted and stacked in their tidy rows like tiles waiting for mortar. Before any cutting could begin, the glazier needed to prepare his cutting tools, and this was a task he did not delegate to the boy. He walked to the side bench where the lever tool roll lay, unrolled it with a single smooth pull, and removed the main cutting iron. This iron was a bar of tempered steel about the length of his forearm, set into a turned wooden handle that had been worn to a comfortable dart patina by the grip of his own hand over many years. The cutting tip was a small heavy wheel ground to a V-shaped edge, and it rotated on a short axle with a faint, well-oiled click when he spun it with his thumb. The glazier examined the wheel closely in the light from the doorway, tilting it until he could see the edge without any glare, and he found that it was still sharp and free of nicks. Satisfied, he set the cutting iron on the bench and turned to the small charcoal brazier that stood near the back wall. A brazier the boy had lit earlier with a handful of coals and a few puffs of the bellows. The coals glowed a steady, deep orange beneath their coating of grey ash, and the heat rising from them made the air above the brazier shimmer slightly. The glazier placed the tip of a second older cutting iron into the coals and left it there to warm, because hot iron would score the glass more cleanly than cold iron, opening a fine, even crack along the chalk line without causing the glass to splinter or jump. He did not rush this heating. He stood by the brazier with his arms folded loosely, watching the iron tip slowly change color from black to a deep cherry red, and then he withdrew it with a pair of small tongs and laid it on a firebrick to cool to the right working temperature, a point he judged by holding the back of his hand just above the tip and feeling the warmth radiate upward in a steady, invisible wave. While the iron cooled, he explained to the boy Robin, in a low and patient voice, what they would do that morning. The pale green sheets would be cut first, because they formed the bulk of the work and would yield the most pieces. The amber sheet would follow, yielding the border fillets, and the blue sheet would be cut last, with extra care, because the blue was thin and temperamental and had the fine, rippled surface that he had noted the day before. The boy was to stand on the opposite side of the cutting bench and catch each finished piece as the glazier tapped it free, placing it gently onto a padded tray lined with soft, scraped lambskin. The boy was not to talk during the cutting, because a sudden word or a loud noise could cause the glazier's hand to twitch and ruin a piece that had taken months to import and weeks to mark. The boy understood this rule. It had been explained during his first week in the workshop, when a poorly aimed hammer blow had shattered a small pane of costly ruby, and the glazier had not raised his voice, but had simply set down the hammer and walked to the door and stood there for a very long time, while the boy swept up the fragments in a silence that was heavier than any scolding. So the boy simply nodded now, took up his padded tray, and positioned himself at the bench with his feet planted and his hands steady. The glazier lifted the felt cover from the first pale green sheet, folding it back carefully so that the chalk marks remained untouched. The diamond outlines lay on the glass like a pale, ghostly net, each shape connecting to its neighbors at the points, the whole arrangement filling the sheet from edge to edge with very little waste. He set the wooden straight edge along the first chalk line, aligning it by eye and then by feel, running his fingers along the junction of wood and glass to be sure there was no gap. The straight edge was made of a dark, dense tropical wood that had come to York by way of Hull and the Hanseatic ships, and its weight was enough to hold the glass steady without clamping. He then picked up the cutting iron, which had cooled to the right temperature, a warmth that was pleasant but not painful to touch, and he lowered the wheeled tip to the glass at the very start of the chalk line. The cut began with a soft, high hiss, a sound like the tear of fine linen as the wheel bit into the surface and opened a tiny, precise fissure that ran ahead of the iron in a continuous, quivering track. The glazier drew the iron along the straight edge with a motion that was perfectly uniform, neither speeding up nor slowing down, his shoulder and arm moving as one unit, while his wrist stayed locked. The sound of the cut filled the workshop, a sustained, whispering note that seemed to hang in the air, and when he reached the end of the line, he lifted the iron cleanly, without a wobble or a second stroke. The score line lay on the glass exactly where the chalk had been, visible only as a fine, bright thread of reflected light. He then set down the cutting iron, picked up a small wooden mallet with a head wrapped in leather, and began to tap gently on the underside of the glass along the score line. The tapping was rhythmic and steady, a series of soft, muted knocks that travelled the length of the cut like a small, slow drumbeat. The glass creaked faintly as the fissure deepened, the sound very low and internal, as if the material was sighing in its sleep. After perhaps 20 taps, the crack ran all the way through, and the first diamond quarry fell away from the sheet with a small, clean snap, landing on the padded bench where the boy immediately picked it up and placed it, point upward, onto the lambskin tray. The glazier paused for a moment and examined the cut edge of the remaining sheet, checking that the break was smooth and that no secondary cracks had veered off into the body of the glass. The edge was perfect, a pale crystalline line that caught the light in a thin green glint. He nodded to himself, repositioned the straight edge along the next chalk line, and began the second cut. The morning passed in this way, cut after cut, each one identical to the last in method, and yet each one slightly different in the way the glass responded. Some pieces separated from the sheet with a single tap of the mallet, as if they had been waiting to come free. Others required a long series of gentle taps all around the score line, and the glazier would work his way patiently around the diamond, tapping the north point and then the south, the east, and then the west, until the piece loosened and dropped into the boy's waiting hands. A few pieces cracked along unexpected lines, splitting not along the chalk, but along some invisible weakness buried in the glass, a bubble or a ripple that had been born in the furnace and had waited all this time to reveal itself. When this happened, the glazier did not speak, did not sigh or frown. He simply removed the ruined piece with the same care he used for the good ones, placed it gently onto a separate tray for offcuts, and continued to the next chalk line. The waste tray slowly filled with a small collection of misfits, a diamond with a broken point, a quarry that had split cleanly down its middle, a sliver of green that was too narrow to use, but too clean to throw away. These offcuts would be saved for small repairs or future projects where a tiny fill piece was needed, because no glass, however flawed, was truly worthless in a glazier's shop. By the time the first pale green sheet had been fully cut, the tray at the boy's elbow held 3 dozen complete diamond quarries arranged in neat, overlapping rows, their edges catching the light and throwing tiny green reflections onto the workshop wall, like a scattered handful of emeralds seen through water. The glazier straightened up from the bench, stretching his back with a slow, careful movement that made the joints of his spine give a faint creak, and he walked to the door to look out at the street for a moment. The view had changed. The sun was now high enough to shorten the shadows to dark pools directly beneath the feet of passers-by, and the tempo of the street had picked up into the busy hum of midday, full of voices and footsteps and the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer from the lane behind the workshop. He breathed the outside air, which was warm and slightly dusty, and then returned to the bench where the second pale green sheet waited under its blanket of felt. The boy Robin had used the pause to stretch his own legs, walking to the back of the workshop to drink a dipper of water from the bucket that stood on a stone shelf near the glass rack. The water was cool and tasted of the iron hoop that bound the bucket, and it washed the thin, chalky dust from his throat. When he returned to the bench, the glazier had already positioned the straight edge on the first chalk line of the second green sheet and was lowering the cutting iron with the same unhurried precision as before. The soft hiss of the wheel filled the workshop again, and the boy resumed his station, his hands open and still, his eyes on the bright edge of the cut. The second sheet behaved much like the first, though it was the one that was fractionally narrower, and the glazier had to adjust the placement of the outer diamonds to fit the available glass. This meant some of the quarries at the edges would be slightly smaller, but the difference was a matter of 1/8 of an inch or less, and when the panel was assembled and held in its lead cames and set into the tracery high above the church floor, no eye would be able to detect the variation. The glazier did not explain this to the boy because the boy would learn to see such adjustments himself over years of working at this bench. The boy did, however, notice that the current row of diamonds was running closer to the edge of the sheet than the previous row, and he stored this observation in his mind as a small, growing piece of his craft knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could not be taught with words but only absorbed through the eyes and the hands, and the long, slow hours of standing beside a master at work. The cutting of the second green sheet took slightly longer than the first, because the afternoon light had begun to shift into the glazier's eyes when he faced the back of the workshop, throwing a glare across the surface of the glass that made the chalk lines harder to follow. He compensated by tilting the sheet very slightly, propping its far edge on a thin wooden shim, and this adjustment brought the lines back into clear relief. The boy noticed this too and filed it away. The workshop grew warmer as the afternoon advanced, the heat of the charcoal brazier rising to meet the sun's warmth through the back window, and the glazier paused once to wipe his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt, leaving a faint smudge of chalk dust on his brow. The boy did not mention this, though he saw it, and the glazier did not notice it himself until much later, when he caught his reflection in a dark piece of polished horn that hung near the lantern, and he wiped the smudge away with a damp thumb. When the second green sheet was done and its quarries had joined the first batch on the boy's tray, the glazier lifted the tray and carried it to the layout bench, where he would later arrange the whole panel on the cartoon. The tray was heavy now, containing more than 70 diamond quarries in varying shades of pale green, each one slightly different in thickness and bubble pattern and the way the light played through its surface. Together they made a soft collective rustle as the tray was set down, a sound like dry leaves stirred by a breeze. The glazier covered the tray with a clean cloth to keep the dust off, and then he returned to the cutting bench to begin work on the amber sheet that would yield the border fillets. The amber sheet had been marked with long narrow rectangles running parallel to its longer edge, and these required a slightly different technique because the cuts were straight and continuous over a greater distance. The glazier used a longer straight edge for these, a smooth ruler of oiled beech that spanned the full width of the sheet, and he drew the cutting iron along the chalk lines in slow, sustained pulls that lasted several full breaths from start to finish. The sound was deeper than the sound of cutting the quarries, a lower, more resonant hiss that seemed to vibrate in the wood of the bench itself. The amber glass was softer than the green. It parted more readily along the score line, and the tap of the mallet produced a dull, muted note that the glazier felt through the handle rather than heard. The fillets came away in long, slender strips, each one perfectly straight and even in width, their edges glowing a warm, translucent honey orange where the light caught them. The boy placed these strips on a separate tray, handling them with extra care because their length made them prone to snapping if held at the wrong angle. After the amber fillets came the blue diamonds for the corner accents, and here the glazier's movements became slower and more deliberate, as if he were handling a small sleeping animal that might startle. He did not use the hot iron for the blue glass. He used a small handheld diamond, a tool consisting of a tiny natural diamond crystal set into a brass tip on a slender wooden handle, a tool that gave him more control over the pressure and depth of the score. The blue glass was thin and full of the wave-like stresses he had noted, and it sang at a higher pitch under the diamond point, a thin, silvery ring that was almost musical. He scored each small diamond outline with a single feather-light pass, barely breathing as he did so, and when he tapped them free, he used not the mallet but the rounded back of the grozing pliers, tapping so softly that the sound was barely audible even to the boy standing right beside him. The blue diamonds came away slowly, one by one, each one a cool, smoky jewel that looked entirely different from the warm greens and ambers on the tray. Only 6 were needed, and he cut 8, allowing for the possibility that 1 or 2 might break during grozing or assembly. The 2 extra blue diamonds were placed on the off-cut tray, where they glowed like chips of winter sky among the broken greens. By the time the last cut was made and the last piece placed on its tray, The afternoon had mellowed into late golden light, and the street outside was quieting again as the shops closed their shutters and the carts rolled back towards the city gates. The lantern flame, which had been pale and insignificant all day, began to assert itself once more, casting a warm yellow circle on the ceiling beams. The glazier stood at the bench with his hands resting flat on its surface, surveying the trays of cut glass, the rows of green quarries, the stacks of amber border strips, the small blue diamonds clustered in a corner like a handful of forget-me-nots. The cutting was done, and nothing had gone so wrong that it could not be put right. He felt the familiar, quiet satisfaction of having moved a task from the column of things undone to the column of things finished, a satisfaction that was as mild and steady as the lantern flame itself. He turned to the boy and told him in his usual low-level tone that tomorrow they would begin grozing the edges to their final dimensions, a task that would take at least a full day and perhaps part of another, because every edge of every piece had to be nibbled smooth and true, so that the lead cames would grip them without strain. The boy nodded, his face serious and tired but not unhappy, and he began to tidy the bench, brushing the glass splinters and chalk dust into a clay pot with a small hand brush, while the glazier banked the coals in the brazier and wiped down the cutting tools with an oiled cloth. Outside, the rooks were settling into the elms for the night, and their calls drifted through the open door as a soft, fading commentary on the close of the working day. The glazier stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the sky turn from gold to grey above the rooftops, and then he came back inside and drew the door shut, and the workshop was silent except for the small, scratchy sound of the boy's brush sweeping the last of the day's dust into the pot. The morning set aside for grozing arrived with a low, even sky, the colour of unwashed fleece, a sky that pressed down on the rooftops of York and made the light inside the workshop soft and shadowless, the kind of light that was gentle on the eyes and perfect for close work. The glazier had opened the door to this grey, milky morning and found the street already damp from a mist that was not quite rain, a fine, drifting moisture that beaded on the wool of his cap and left tiny, bright droplets on the iron keys in his hand. He had wiped the keys on his doublet before hanging them on the hook, and then he had set about preparing the grozing bench for the long, patient task that would fill the day and perhaps a portion of the next, a task that required no flame and no loud tools, but only the steady grip of pliers and the slow, repetitive nibbling of glass edges into their final, perfect shapes. The boy Robin had arrived a few minutes after the door was opened, his shoulders dark with damp, and his hair plastered to his forehead in flat, wet strands. He had taken his usual stool without being told, but the glazier had motioned him towards the grozing bench instead, where a second stool had been set up beside a small, low table of oak that was scarred all over with the pale crescent marks of countless grozing bites. The boy sat down and looked at the trays of cut glass that the glazier was now uncovering, the 3 dozen green quarries from the first sheet, the 3 dozen and some from the second, the long amber border fillets stacked like thin, brittle wafers, and the 8 small blue diamonds that seemed to hold a piece of the morning sky trapped inside their rippled surfaces. The boy understood without being told that today they would go through each piece one by one, checking every edge and every point, and that this work would be slow and repetitive and could not be hurried because a poorly grozed edge would leave a gap for water, or a sharp point that might crack the lead came when the panel was assembled. The grozing pliers that the glazier now laid out on the bench were not like ordinary gripping tools. They were made with jaws that met at a slight angle, and the inner faces of those jaws were notched with a series of fine, parallel grooves that could bite into the edge of a piece of glass and break away a tiny fragment without sending a crack across the whole piece. The handles were long, giving good leverage, and they were wrapped in thin strips of oiled leather where the glazier's palms had worn the original wood smooth. He had 3 pairs, each with a slightly different jaw width, and he set them in a neat row beside the first tray of green quarries. Alongside the pliers he placed a small padded anvil made of a block of hard maple covered with a layer of felted wool, and this anvil would serve as a rest for the glass while he worked the edges. He also placed a shallow clay dish of water on the bench, because dipping the glass in water before grozing helped the small fragments to break cleanly rather than splinter, a trick that the boy was still learning to appreciate. The glazier took his seat on the stool, adjusted the position of the lantern so that its light fell across the bench at a low angle, and selected the first green quarry from the tray. He held it up to the light for a moment, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger, and he saw that the cut edges were clean but slightly rough, with tiny, almost invisible jagged crests left by the cutting iron and the tapping mallet. These jagged crests, if left as they were, would prevent the lid came from seating snugly against the glass, and over time the lid would stretch and the window would loosen in its frame. So he rested the quarry on the padded anvil, took up the first pair of grozing pliers, and fitted the notched jaws against one of the cut edges, aligning them so that they would bite away only a sliver, no wider than a hair. He squeezed the handles gently, and the pliers made a sound that was exactly like a small muted click, the sound of glass giving way in a controlled, deliberate fracture. A tiny chip fell away onto the bench, and the edge now showed a smooth, even surface that looked almost polished. He moved the pliers a fraction of an inch further along the same edge and repeated the motion, click, and then again, click, and then again, working his way down the entire length of the diamond side in a series of tiny, incremental bites that followed one another as steadily as a row of stitches. The boy watched this process with the attentive stillness that had become his habit, his hands resting in his lap and his eyes following every movement of the pliers. After the glazier had grown 2 full edges of the first quarry, he passed the piece and the pliers to the boy, pointing to the third edge and telling him in a low, calm voice to continue. The boy took the pliers and the quarry, his fingers slightly clumsy at first as he found the right grip, and he fitted the jaws against the glass just as he had seen his master do. His first squeeze was too timid, and the pliers slipped without biting. His second squeeze was better, producing a tiny crisp sound and a falling chip. But he had taken off too much, and the edge now had a slight, shallow dip that would need to be evened out with small bites on either side. The glazier leaned over, examined the dip without expression, and told the boy to work the edges around it until the line was straight again, a task that would take 5 or 6 extra bites and teach a small lesson about pressure. The boy nodded, his face showing a flicker of concentration, and he resumed the careful, rhythmic squeezing of the pliers, while the glazier took up the second pair of pliers and began work on the next quarry. The morning continued in this quiet, dual rhythm, the two of them seated opposite each other at the grozing bench, their pliers making a soft, irregular chorus of clicks and snaps that blended with the distant sounds of the street and the occasional flutter of the lantern flame. The green quarries moved from the full tray to the anvil to the finish tray, which the glazier had lined with a fresh piece of lambskin to receive the completed pieces. Each quarry, when fully grozed, had edges that were perfectly straight and points that met at clean, sharp angles, and the piece as a whole fit precisely within the dimensions he had established with his chalk template. He checked every 10th piece against the template, laying the slate diamond over the glass and squinting to see if any green showed beyond the edge. Most pieces fit exactly. A few were slightly oversized and had to be returned to the anvil for another round of bites. A few were slightly undersized, and these were set aside on a separate tray for possible use as fill pieces in the lower corners of the window, where the stone tracery would cast a shadow and the difference would pass unseen. The grozing produced a steady accumulation of waste on the bench and on the floor around the stools. Tiny, glittering fragments of green glass that caught the light in bright points, and a fine white dust that settled on the sleeves of the glazier's shirt and the front of the boy's tunic. This dust was mildly irritating to the skin and the nose, and the glazier paused after the first hour to dampen a cloth in the water dish and wipe down the bench surface, clearing the debris into the clay waste pot. The boy used the pause to stretch his fingers, which had begun to cramp slightly from the unaccustomed grip of the pliers, and to drink another dipper of water from the bucket. The glazier dried his hands on the front of his leather apron, which he had put on at the start of the day to protect his doublet from the abrasive dust, and then he returned to his stool and picked up the first of the amber border fillets. The amber pieces required a slightly different approach, because their long, narrow shape made them prone to snapping in the middle if held at the wrong angle or gripped too near the end. The glazier supported each fillet along its full length with his left hand, cradling it on the padded anvil like a slender, brittle bone, while his right hand worked the pliers along the edge in small, precise bites that traveled the entire length of the strip from one end to the other. The amber glass was softer than the green, and it groused more easily, the chips falling away in slightly larger flakes that were a warm honey-brown color and felt almost waxy to the touch. The boy, who'd finished his share of the green quarries, was now given a stack of the shorter border fillets to practice on, and he approached them with the same serious, careful attention he had learned on the quarries, his movements becoming gradually smoother as the hour wore on. The glazier watched him for a moment from the corner of his eye and saw that the boy's grip had improved and that his bites were now more consistent in size, and this observation was filed away in the same silent internal ledger where he kept track of the boy's progress. The blue diamonds, when the time came to grouse them, were handled by the glazier alone. He cleared the bench of everything except the anvil and the smallest pair of pliers, and he worked on each blue piece with a level of focus that made the boy stop his own work and simply watch. The blue glass was so thin and so full of internal stresses that even the slight pressure of the grousing pliers could send a fracture running across the whole piece, and the glazier compensated by taking the smallest bites possible, each one no larger than a grain of sand, working his way around the four edges of each diamond with a patience that seemed to stretch the minutes into something longer and slower. The clicks of the pliers were quieter here, almost delicate, and the blue chips that fell away were so tiny that they looked like dust motes of pale cobalt settling onto the dark wood of the bench. One of the 8 diamonds did indeed crack, a fine hair-thin split that ran from the edge to the center and made the piece unusable, and the glazier set it aside without comment, glad that he had cut 2 extra. The remaining 7 were perfect, their edges smooth as polished stone and their points sharp and true. And when he held them up together in the grey light from the doorway, they glowed with a cool, even radiance that would, when set into the corners of the window, give the whole composition a quiet anchor in the midst of its green and amber warmth. The afternoon had now advanced, though the grey sky made it hard to tell the exact hour, and the light in the workshop had begun its slow, almost imperceptible fade towards the dimmer tones of early evening. The glazier lit a second lantern, hanging it from a hook nearer to the grousing bench, and its flame joined the first in casting a double set of shadows that moved gently on the walls as the 2 workers shifted on their stools. The boy had returned to the green quarries and was now finishing the last row of the second sheet, his pliers moving with a rhythm that was almost as steady as his master's, though still slower and more deliberate. The glazier had moved on to checking the dimensions of each completed piece with the slate template, a task that was as repetitive as the grousing itself, and he held each diamond up to the light, placed the template over it, turned it slightly, checked all 4 edges, and then placed it in the finished tray with a small final tap of satisfaction that was audible only to himself. The task of grousing was not, in the larger scheme of the window's creation, the most dramatic or the most visible, but it was the step that made all the other steps possible. A poorly cut piece could sometimes be saved by careful grousing. A perfectly cut piece could be ruined by a careless hand. The glazier thought about this as he worked, not in words, but in a kind of slow, drifting awareness that accompanied the mechanical movements of his hands. He thought about how the lead cames would grip these smooth, even edges, how the cement would seal the tiny gaps, how the finished panel would hang in the north aisle window for years, decades, perhaps a century or more, and how no one who knelt in the church during morning prayers would ever notice the edges of the quarries or wonder about the man who had groused them. That was the nature of the craft, and he had long ago made peace with it. The work was quiet, and so was its legacy. When the last piece had been groused and checked and placed in the finished tray, the glazier set down his pliers and stood up from the stool, his back giving a faint, familiar ache from the hours of leaning over the bench. He walked to the door and looked out at the street, where the mist had thickened into a proper drizzle that was now falling straight down in fine silver lines, pattering softly on the cobbles and dripping from the carved eaves of the opposite houses. The air smelt of wet stone and wet wool, and the faint, clean scent of the rain itself, a scent that always seemed to wash the city clean of its daily odors. He stood there for a while, breathing slowly and letting his eyes rest on the empty street, and then he turned back into the workshop where the boy was already sweeping the glass dust into a neat pile with the hand-brush, his movements slow and tired, but still careful. The grousing was finished. The quarries, the fillets, and the blue accents all lay in their separate trays, their edges smooth and their points sharp, waiting now for the next step, the unrolling of the cartoon and the long, patient assembly of the panel on the layout bench. But that would be tomorrow's work, or perhaps the work of the day after, and for now it was enough to hang the pliers on their hooks, to cover the finished trays with their cloths, and to bank the lanterns so that the workshop would be dark and still through the coming night. The glazier did all these things in his usual slow, steady way, and then he put on his felt hat and locked the door behind himself and the boy, and the two of them walked off into the soft, grey drizzle that was now falling evenly over every roof and spire in the city of York. The morning that followed the grousing was the kind of morning that arrived without visible sun, the sky a smooth, pale canopy that seemed to diffuse the light equally in every direction, so that shadows were soft and faint and the edges of buildings looked blurred against the air. The glazier had walked to the workshop through streets that were still damp from the previous day's drizzle, though the rain itself had stopped during the night, leaving behind only the dark, wet cobbles and the occasional drip from the high gutters, a sound that came at irregular intervals and had no pattern. He opened the door to find the workshop exactly as he had left it. The lanterns dark, the trays of glazed glass covered with their cloths, the grousing bench still bearing a faint dusting of powdered glass that the boy would sweep later. The air inside was cool and still, heavy with the familiar smells of oil and tallow and damp stone, and the glazier moved through it with the quiet, automatic ease of someone who had begun his day in this room for more years than he bothered to count. Today the work would shift from the small, repetitive nibbling of edges to the larger, slower task of arranging all the finished pieces on the cartoon, the full-sized paper pattern that would serve as the map for the entire window panel. This step always pleased the glazier in a quiet way, because it was here that the separate trace of glass, the green quarries, the amber fillets, the small blue diamonds began to become a single, unified thing rather than a collection of parts. He had drawn the cartoon himself 3 days earlier, sitting at the counter with his boxwood rule and his lump of chalk and his large sheet of heavy, cream-coloured paper that had been made in a mill near Ripon and brought to York by a carrier who also transported cheese. The paper was thick and slightly rough, with a texture like fine pressed wool, and it had been sized with a wash of diluted hide glue to make it stiff enough to hold its shape when the heavy glass pieces were laid upon it. He had unrolled it once, the evening after taking the measurements at the church, and had spent a full hour drawing the grid of quarries and the border fillets and the corner positions for the blue accents, using a ruler and a compass and a sharpened stick of charcoal that left lines as fine as spider silk. The lines were now fixed and dry, and the cartoon waited, rolled around a wooden cylinder on a shelf above the layout bench. The layout bench itself was the largest work surface in the workshop, a broad, flat table of elm that had been built in place against the right-hand wall and could not be moved. Its top was a single slab nearly 7 feet long and 4 feet wide, supported on heavy square legs that were braced with cross timbers, and its surface had been planed smooth and oiled repeatedly over the years until it had the feel of polished stone. Along its edges, the glazier had drilled a series of shallow holes at regular intervals, holes into which he fitted the small turned pegs of oak that held the glass pieces in position during assembly. The bench was now bare except for a thin layer of dust that had settled since the last project, and the glazier spent the first part of the morning wiping it clean with a dampened cloth, drawing the cloth across the wide surface in long, overlapping arcs that lifted the dust and left the elm glowing a deep, quiet brown. The boy Robin arrived during this wiping, his hair once again flattened by the damp morning air, and he helped by carrying the rolled cartoon from its shelf to the bench and holding it steady while the glazier untied the flax string that bound it. The unrolling of the cartoon was a slow process that could not be rushed because the paper, for all its stiffness, could tear if handled roughly or creased if bent at too sharp an angle. The glazier unrolled it inch by inch, pressing the paper flat against the bench with his palms and smoothing out the slight curl at the edges, while the boy placed small, smooth stones at each corner to hold it down. These stones had been collected from the River Oss years ago, 3 flat, oval river stones of a dark grey colour and one of a mottled brown, and their only purpose was to serve as weights for the cartoon. They had no other function, but they had become part of the workshop's small inventory of silent, useful objects, and the glazier would have noticed their absence if they were ever lost. With the stones holding the corners, the cartoon lay flat and still, and its pattern was now visible in full. A grid of diamond shapes arranged in alternating rows across the two main lights, framed by the narrow rectangles of the border fillets, with small square positions at the four corners of each light where the blue diamonds would sit. The charcoal lines were grey-black and precise, and the whole composition had the orderly, calm appearance of a well-drawn map. The glazier stood back from the bench and studied the cartoon for a long moment, tracing the lines with his eyes and checking the alignment of the grid against the measurements he still carried in his memory. He noted that the central row of quarries in the left light was slightly narrower than its counterpart in the right light, a discrepancy that reflected the fractional difference in width between the two green glass sheets he had cut. The cartoon had been drawn to accommodate this difference, so the panel would still fit the stone tracery perfectly, even though its two halves were not exact mirrors. This was the sort of detail that no one would ever see, but the glazier knew it was there, and that knowledge was part of the quiet pride he took in the work, a pride that was too deep and too habitual to express itself in words. With the cartoon flat and secure, the glazier and the boy began the careful work of transferring the grossed glass pieces from their trays to the layout bench. The glazier fetched the first tray of green quarries, removed its protective cloth, and set it on a low stool beside the bench. He then picked up the first quarry, a diamond with a slight bubble trapped near its center, and placed it on its corresponding diamond outline on the cartoon, aligning the 4 points with the 4 corners of the drawn shape. The fit was not perfect on the first try. One point overhung the chalk line by a sliver, and he shifted the piece slightly, nudging it with the tip of his finger until it sat exactly inside its borders. He then took one of the small oak pegs from a wooden box on the bench, inserted it into the nearest hole, and pressed it gently against the edge of the glass. The peg held the quarry in place with a light, steady pressure, and the glazier moved on to the next piece. The boy joined in after watching for a minute, taking quarries from the tray and placing them on their assigned positions with the same slow, deliberate care he had learned at the grossing bench. The two of them worked side by side, their hands moving back and forth between the tray and the cartoon, placing diamonds and adjusting their positions and inserting pegs. A quiet, repetitive sequence that filled the workshop with a soft rhythm of small sounds. The click of glass against glass as a piece was lifted from the tray, the faint scrape of the peg against the wooden hole, the occasional tap of a fingernail against a quarry to nudge it into alignment. The morning light, still pale and diffuse, fell across the bench and made the green glass glow softly, and the amber fillets, when they were brought out from their tray, added a warmer, yellower note that spread across the cartoon in narrow bands. The arrangement of the quarries followed a logic that was simple and deeply satisfying. Each row of diamonds interlocked with the next, like the teeth of two combs fitted together, and the glazier worked from the base of the left light upward, filling the bottom row first and then the next, checking the alignment of each piece against its neighbors and against the drawn lines. When a quarry did not sit quite right, when it was a fraction too large or too small for its assigned space, he would either shave a tiny bit more from its edge with the grossing pliers, which he kept at hand for just this purpose, or select a different quarry from the tray that better matched the required dimensions. The tray contained more quarries than were needed for the cartoon, a deliberate surplus that gave him the freedom to choose the best fit for each position, and the pieces that were not used would be returned to the rack for future projects. The boy learned this system by observing, watching how the glazier would sometimes hold two quarries side by side, comparing their sizes with a quick practice glance before placing the better match on the cartoon and returning the other to the tray. The boulder fillets were arranged next, and these required a different placement strategy because they were long and narrow and had to form a continuous frame around the diamond grid. The glazier laid the first amber fillet along the left edge of the left light, aligning its inner edge with the points of the quarries it would frame, and he saw that the fit was good, the amber strip running straight and true from the base to the arch without any gap. He placed pegs at intervals along its length, enough to hold it steady, but not so many that the pegs would crowd the bench and interfere with the adjacent pieces. The right edge fillet came next, then the bottom horizontal fillet, and finally the curved fillets that would follow the arch at the top. These curved fillets had been cut slightly longer than needed and would be trimmed to exact length once the panel was assembled in its lead cames. But for now, their positions on the cartoon allowed the glazier to see how the whole composition would look when finished. The amber light they cast was gentle and mellow, like the light of a candle seen through a jar of honey, and it harmonized with the cooler green of the quarries in a way that was calm and complete. The small blue diamonds were the last pieces to be placed. The glazier handled them personally, taking them from their separate tray one at a time and positioning them at the four corners of each main light, where the border fillets met and created a small square junction. The blue accents were tiny against the larger field of green and amber, no bigger than the tip of his thumb, but their color stood out with a clarity that drew the eye without shouting. A quiet, cool note in the warm arrangement. When all 8 positions were filled, he had cut 8 blue diamonds, 1 had cracked, and 7 remained, so he used 6 and kept the 7th as a spare. The glazier stood back from the bench and looked at the cartoon as a whole. The window panel, still only a pattern of glass pieces resting on paper, was now fully visible from edge to edge, and it had the balanced, unpretentious beauty of a thing made without haste and without ornament. There were no faces in it, no emblems, no script, nothing that could be read as a statement. It was simply a field of diamonds that would admit the daylight and cast it onto the stone floor in soft coloured patches, the same way that 1,000 other parish windows did in 1,000 other churches across the north of England. The afternoon had arrived by the time the last peg was placed and the last piece adjusted, and the glazier felt the familiar, subtle shift in the air that meant the day was moving towards its later hours. The light outside had not changed its colour, the sky remaining that same pale, even grey, but the sounds of the street had changed their character. The vendors' calls had faded, replaced by the slower, more scattered noises of carts returning home and dogs barking in distant yards. The boy had gone to the back of the workshop to drink from the water bucket and was now sitting on his stool, his hands still and his eyelids slightly heavy, though he was not asleep. The glazier left him there and made a slow circuit of the layout bench, checking each piece for alignment, each peg for tightness, each border fillet for any sign of a crack that might have opened during handling. He found no problems, only the quiet, orderly array of glass that he had spent the whole day arranging, and he allowed himself a single, slow breath that was as close to a sigh of satisfaction as his habits permitted. The cartoon would now serve as the guide for the next major step, the fitting of the lead cames and the assembly of the panel into a single, rigid whole. But that would be tomorrow's labour, requiring the lead spool and the lathkin and the careful bending of the soft metal channels around every edge of every piece. And the glazier was not a man who rushed from one task to the next without a pause. He covered the entire layout bench with a large, clean cloth, tucking the edges under the corners of the cartoon so that no dust would settle on the glass overnight, and he banked the coals in the brazier until they glowed a low, sleepy orange. He then walked to the door, where the boy was already waiting with his cap in his hands, and the two of them stepped out into the grey, quiet evening, the glazier locking the door behind him with the largest key. The street was empty and damp, the cobbles reflecting the pale sky in a long glistening stripe, and somewhere the minster bell tolled a single note that seemed to hang in the air for a very long time before it faded into the general silence. The glazier pulled his hat lower over his brow and began his slow walk home, the image of the ordered diamonds and the amber borders still resting in his mind like a quiet, finished thought. The morning that had been chosen for the assembly of the panel began with a faint, silvery light that came through the high back window and touched the covered layout bench with a soft, diffuse glow. The glazier arrived at the workshop before the boy, as he almost always did, and he spent the first quarter hour in quiet preparation, moving through the room with the slow, practiced steps of someone who knew exactly what the day required. He lifted the cloth from the layout bench and folded it carefully, setting it aside on the counter, and he stood for a while looking at the cartoon with its grid of glass pieces held in place by the small oak pegs, the green diamonds and the amber fillets and the blue accents, all waiting exactly where he had left them. Nothing had shifted overnight, and the arrangement was as true as it had been the evening before. He then turned his attention to the lead spool mounted on the wall, the large wooden cylinder that held the coiled length of H-sectioned came, and he pulled a fresh length free, drawing it across the workshop in a long, soft ribbon that made a whispering sound as it unspooled. The lead came was the skeleton of the window, the flexible, dark metal that would hold every piece of glass in its place, and the work of fitting it was, in the glazier's mind, the step that turned a collection of cut stones into a single, unified panel. The boy Robin arrived as the glazier was laying the first lengths of lead, came across a padded horse, a low, sturdy wooden stand that had been built for the sole purpose of supporting the lead during cutting and bending. The boy hung his damp cap on the peg by the door and came to stand beside the layout bench, his eyes moving over the cartoon with a look of quiet recognition. He had helped place many of those pieces, and seeing them again this morning was like encountering a familiar task in a familiar order. The glazier acknowledged him with a brief nod and then pointed to the small clay pot of tallow that sat on the shelf beside the lead spool. The boy took the pot and brought it to the bench, knowing from previous assemblies that the lead cane would need to be lubricated lightly with tallow at its channels, so that the glass would slide in without catching and the lathkin would not drag against the metal. This was a small task, but it was one the boy could do without supervision, and he set about it with a scrap of clean wool, dabbing the wool into the tallow and then wiping it along the inner grooves of the lead strips that the glazier had already cut to length. The glazier worked at the padded horse with a pair of heavy shears that were made for cutting lead, their blades short and thick and their handles wrapped in leather that had darkened to a deep, oily brown. He cut the first length of cane to match the bottom border of the left light, measuring it against the cartoon with a quick placement of the strip along the drawn line before snipping it cleanly with a single, firm squeeze of the shears. The sound of the cut was a dull, soft crunch, more felt than heard, and it left the end of the cane with a flat, clean edge that would later be joined to its neighbors with a spot of solder. He cut the two side border canes next, each one slightly longer than the cartoon required, because the top ends would be trimmed once the arch pieces were in place. The arch pieces themselves were the trickiest to cut, as they had to follow the gentle curve of the window's tracery, and the glazier bent each one by hand before cutting it, pressing the lead strip against the edge of the bench and curving it in slow, careful increments until it matched the drawn arc on the cartoon. The lead was soft and compliant, yielding to the pressure of his thumbs with a smooth, gradual give, and it held its shape once bent, the metal retaining a memory of the curve that was strong enough to stay put during assembly. With the border canes cut and bent and lightly tallowed by the boy, the glazier moved to the layout bench and began the assembly proper. This was a process that could not be hurried and that followed a strict order, a sequence of steps that had been established by glaziers long before him and that he had learned during his own apprenticeship in a workshop not far from this one. Though that earlier workshop was now a chandler's storehouse, and its master long since buried in the churchyard of St. Helens. He began by removing the O-pegs from the bottom row of the left light, lifting them one at a time and dropping them into their box. And then he slid. The first border came into position along the base of the cartoon, pressing its grooved channel against the lower edges of the first row of quarries. The cane accepted the glass with a soft, snug resistance, the lead spreading slightly to accommodate the thickness of the green diamond and then closing around it in a grip that was firm but not tight enough to stress the glass. The glazier then took up the lathkin, the tool that would be his constant companion for the rest of the day. The lathkin was a simple instrument, a flat blade of polished boxwood shaped like a small blunt knife, and its purpose was to press the lead cane open or closed as needed during assembly. The glazier used it now to ease open the upper channel of the base cane, spreading the lead just wide enough to receive the points of the quarries that would sit in the next row, and then he began adding those quarries one by one, lifting each diamond from its position on the cartoon, sliding its lower point into the waiting channel, and then pressing the adjacent cane against its upper edges. The lathkin moved constantly in his right hand, a quiet, precise tool that opened and closed the lead channels with small prying motions and gentle flattening presses, while his left hand held each piece of glass steady and his eyes checked the alignment of every edge against its neighbors. The work was slow and repetitive, quarry after quarry, row after row, and the only sounds in the workshop were the faint, silky whisper of glass sliding into lead, the light tap of the lathkin against the cane, and the occasional soft breath from the glazier as he leaned closer to inspect a joint. The boy Robin worked beside him, not on the main assembly, but on the preparation of the shorter interior cames that would run between the rows of quarries. These interior cames were thinner than the border cames, with a narrower profile that would sit almost invisibly between the diamonds, and the boy cut them to length using a smaller pair of shears and a wooden measuring stick that the glazier had marked with the required dimensions. Each interior came had to be exactly the right length, because one that was too short would leave a gap at the joint, and one that was too long would push the adjacent pieces out of alignment. The boy measured each piece twice, as he had been taught, and he laid the finished cames in a neat row along the edge of the bench, where the glazier could pick them up without looking away from the panel. The glazier took each one, pressed it into its channel with the lathkin, and moved on to the next, building the grid of lead and glass from the base upward with the same steady, unhurried pace that marked all his work. The assembling of the panel was not a silent task, but the sounds it made were gentle and muted, the sort of sounds that would not carry beyond the workshop door. The lead cane made a low, dull rasp when it was cut, a soft creak when it was bent, and a series of small padded clicks when the lathkin pressed it against the glass. The glass itself made almost no sound at all, only the faintest chime when the edge of one piece accidentally touched another, a sound so thin and brief that it vanished from the air the moment it was made. The lantern flame on its hook gave a quiet, steady hiss, and the coals in the brazier made a low, muffled pop from time to time, and the street beyond the door provided its usual distant murmur of voices and cartwheels, and the occasional cry of a vendor selling hot pies from a tray. Inside the workshop, however, the dominant impression was of stillness and concentration, of two people moving around a single task, with the slow, coordinated rhythm of a pair of oarsmen on a wide, calm river. The morning moved into afternoon, without any obvious division, the light from the back window simply shifting its angle by degrees, and growing slightly dimmer as the grey sky outside thickened into a heavier overcast. The glazier paused once, straightening his back and flexing his fingers, and he walked to the door to look at the street and to drink a cup of small ale from the jug that the boy had brought that morning. A jug of brown earthenware with a chip at the rim. The air was cool and faintly bitter, and it cut the dust of the lead and the tallow from his throat. He stood in the doorway for only a few minutes, long enough to see a flock of pigeons wheel above the rooftops and a woman in a russet cloak hurry past with a basket of shallots, and then he returned to the bench and resumed his work. The boy had used the pause to drink from his own cup and to eat the heel of a barley loaf, which he chewed slowly while standing by the glass rack, his eyes still on the panel that was growing under the glazier's hands. By the middle of the afternoon, the left light of the panel was fully assembled, its rows of green quarries all seated in their lead cames and framed by the amber border fillets, with the two blue diamonds glowing at the lower corners like small captured pieces of the sky. The glazier stepped back and examined the light, running his gaze along every lead line and every glass edge, checking for gaps or misalignments or any piece that sat too high or too low in its channel. He found one quarry near the top that was slightly proud, its surface standing a fraction above the surrounding pieces, and he pressed it gently into place with the flat of the lathkin, working the lead down around it until the surface was flush and smooth. That was the only adjustment needed, and when it was done, the left light was as complete as it could be at this stage, a solid, rigid sub-panel that could be lifted and moved without coming apart, though it would not receive its final strength until the joints were soldered and the cement was applied. The glazier covered the left light with a clean cloth and turned his attention to the right light, which waited on its half of the cartoon, with its pieces still held in place by the oak pegs. The assembly of the right light proceeded in the same order and with the same techniques, the glazier working from the base upward and the boy cutting the interior cames and the taller border strips. But the pace was slightly slower now because the afternoon was drawing on and the light was beginning its gradual grey fade towards evening. The glazier lit a second lantern and hung it from the hook over the layout bench, and its yellow glow fell across the cartoon and the glass and the dark lines of the lead cames, warming the colors and deepening the shadows. The boy's eyes were heavy, but he continued his work with the same careful attention he had shown all day, measuring the cames and cutting them and laying them in their row, and the glazier noted this persistence without remarking on it, a silent acknowledgement that the boy was learning not just the skills of the craft, but the temperament that the craft required. When the last quarry of the right light was seated and the final border fillet was pressed into place, the glazier set down the lathkin and stood back from the bench. The entire panel now lay before him in two separate lights, each one a complete lattice of lead and glass. The green diamonds and the amber rectangles and the small blue accents all held in their web of dark metal. The lead lines ran straight and true, the joints were tight and close, and the whole assembly had the balanced, orderly look of a thing that had been made with patience and with care. The glazier did not smile, because his face was not given to smiling at inanimate objects, but he did allow himself a slow, quiet exhale that carried the accumulated tension of the day's work out of his shoulders and into the still air of the workshop. The boy standing beside him looked at the two completed lights with an expression that was too tired to be proud, but too interested to be indifferent, and the glazier told him in his usual low, even voice that tomorrow they would solder the joints, and the day after that they would cement the channels, and then the panel would be ready for the church. The boy nodded, understanding that the work was not finished, but that a significant part of it was, and he began the evening routine of sweeping the bench and the floor, while the glazier coiled the remaining lead, came back onto its spool, and wiped the lathkin clean of tallow with a soft, dry rag. The workshop slowly returned to its nighttime order, the tools on their pegs and hooks, the lanterns trimmed and lowered, the trays of surplus glass covered and stored, the brazier coals banked under a blanket of ash. The glazier stood in the doorway for a final moment, watching the last of the daylight drain from the sky above the rooftops, and then he pulled the door shut and turned the key, and the two of them walked off along the damp, darkening street towards their separate homes, the panel resting under its cloth in the quiet, waiting workshop, a thing of lead and glass that was now more whole than it had been when the morning began. The morning of the soldering arrived with a sky that was neither grey nor blue, but a pale, washed-out white, the colour of old linen left too long in the sun, and the air that came through the open workshop door was mild and still, holding the first faint suggestion of the summer that was still some weeks away. The glazier had been in the workshop since shortly after dawn, not working yet, but simply moving through the space, touching the tools, straightening the cloths, adding a few fresh coals to the brazier, and working the small bellows until the embers glowed, a steady, deep orange beneath their coating of ash. The two completed lights of the window panel lay on the layout bench under their covering cloth, their lead cames all fitted and pressed, their glass seated snugly in the channels. But the panel was not yet strong and not yet weatherproof. The lead joints at every intersection were still open, merely touching but not sealed, and a panel in that state would sag if lifted or rattle if the wind caught it. The soldering would change that, joining each lead crossing into a single, solid web that would hold the glass steady through years of sun and frost and the slow, patient pull of the earth's own weight. The boy Robin arrived as the glazier was setting out the soldering tools on a small portable table that he had moved close to the layout bench. The tools were few and simple. The soldering iron itself, a heavy copper bit shaped like a blunt wedge and fitted into a long iron rod with a turned wooden handle. A small jar of flux made from tallow and powdered rosin that had been melted together and allowed to cool into a soft, greasy paste. A coil of soda wire, thin and dull grey, made from lead and tin in proportions that the glazier had learned by feel rather than by measure. A small flat file for cleaning the joints before thick leather that pared iron tip. The boy looked at these tools, recognizing them from previous soldering days, and he went without being asked to fetch the small clay pot of water that would be used to cool the joints after the solder had set. A step that the glazier had taught him prevented the lead from staying soft too long and pulling away from the glass as it cooled unevenly. The glazier began the work by uncovering the left light of the panel, sliding the cloth away with a slow, careful pull so that the glass and the lid were fully exposed to the lantern light and the pale daylight from the door. The panel looked almost complete already, its green quarries and amber fillets forming a neat, orderly lattice. But the glazier's eye went straight to the joints. The 60 or more places where the lead cames crossed one another and where the solder would need to flow. Each joint was a small T-shaped or X-shaped intersection, the ends of the cames meeting at slightly irregular angles, and the gaps between them were tiny but visible, a hair's breadth of empty space that would admit water or slow warping if left unsealed. The glazier took up the small file and began working his way across the panel, touching the file lightly to each joint to remove the thin skin of oxidation that had formed on the lead since the previous day, a task that was as light and repetitive as brushing crumbs from a table. The file made a soft, scratching sound, a sound that was too quiet to be called harsh, and it left each joint bright and slightly silver where the bare metal had been exposed. The boy, meanwhile, had taken up the jar of flux and a small, stiff, bristled brush made from the hair of a badger, and he followed behind the glazier, dabbing the faintly brown paste onto each clean joint with a single, precise stroke. The flux smelled of warm animal fat and pine trees, a smell that was not unpleasant and that the boy had grown used to over his months in the workshop. The paste would help the molten soda to flow smoothly into the joint and bond with the lead, preventing the soda from beading up or running off, and it was important that the flux reached every part of the joint without spilling onto the glass, where it would leave a greasy smudge that would have to be cleaned later. The boy worked carefully, his brush moving from joint to joint with the same steady, patient rhythm he had learned at the grozing bench, and the glazier glanced at his progress once and found it acceptable. With the first half of the left light filed and fluxed, the glazier was ready to begin the soldering itself. He lifted the iron from its rest beside the brazier, where it had been heating in the coals, and he tested its temperature by touching the tip briefly to the scrap of leather, which gave a small, sharp hiss and sent up a curl of pale smoke. The iron was hot enough. He then took the coil of solder wire in his left hand, unspooling a short length between his fingers, and he positioned the tip of the iron over the first joint, a T-shaped crossing where a horizontal interior met, the vertical border came. He touched the solder wire to the joint first, then brought the iron down to meet it, and the solder melted instantly with a faint, wet sigh, flowing into the gap and around the edges of the cane, in a small silvery pool that caught the light and then dulled to a smooth grey finish as the heat dispersed. The glazier lifted the iron, inspected the joint with a quick, close look, and found that the soda had spread evenly and had formed a neat, rounded bump that sealed the intersection completely. He moved to the next joint, and then the next, and then the next. The rhythm of the soldering was different from the rhythms of cutting or grozing or assembly. It was a rhythm of brief, focused action separated by short pauses, a pattern of heat and flow and cooling that repeated itself at every intersection across the panel. The glazier would touch the iron to the joint for no more than a second or two, long enough for the soda to melt and spread, and then he would lift it away and pause, letting the joint cool and harden, while his eyes moved to the next position. The boy wiped each cool joint with a damp cloth after a count of 3, the water hissing softly as it touched the warm lead, and the sudden cooling set the solder firmly in place, locking the joint into a solid mass that would not shift or crack under normal stress. A sequence of file and flux and soda and cool moved across the panel like a slow, orderly wave, and the workshop filled with the quiet, intermittent sounds of the work, the scratch of the file, the dab of the brush, the hiss of the flux, the wet sigh of the melting solder, and the soft steam of the water on cooling metal. The glazier worked through the left light methodically, starting at the base and moving upward row by row, soldering every joint in the border and every crossing in the interior grid. Some joints were slightly more difficult than others, particularly junctions where the curved arch fillets met the straight side fillets, because the cames there were bent at a steeper angle and the gap was wider on one side. To these he applied a tiny extra amount of solder, feeding the wire into the joint with a slow, deliberate pressure until the pool filled the entire space and formed a smooth, even fillet. He then cleaned the iron tip by wiping it on the leather pad, removing the small accumulation of dross and oxidized flux that clung to the copper, and he continued on. The iron had to be reheated from time to time, and each time the glazier returned it to the brazier and waited, watching the coals while the iron regained its proper heat, a pause that lasted perhaps 2 minutes, and that he used to stretch his fingers or drink from the cup of ale that the boy had placed on the counter for him. The boy Robin had by now taken over the filing and fluxing of the right light, working on his own while the glazier finished the left. He moved more slowly than his master, and he had to check each joint twice before applying the flux, but his work was careful and clean, and the glazier saw that the boy had not let the brush stray onto the glass and had not missed any of the intersections. This was progress of a quiet, visible kind, and the glazier filed it away in his mental ledger without comment. When the left light was fully soldered and cooled, the two of them lifted it gently and moved it to the far end of the layout bench, where it would sit while the right light was completed. The left light was now rigid and strong, its LED network a single continuous frame, and it made a low, dull sound when tapped with a fingernail, a sound that was solid and reassuring. The soldering of the right light followed the same pattern and the same rhythm, and by the time the glazier reached the final joints near the top of the arch, the afternoon had arrived in full, and the light from the back window had taken on a slightly warmer tone, though the sky outside remained that same pale, even white. The boy was tired now, his movements slower and his eyes blinking more often. But he stayed at his task, wiping the cooling joints with the damp cloth and handing fresh lengths of solder wire when the glazier's coil ran low. The glazier himself showed no sign of fatigue. His hands were steady and his pace was unchanged, and he worked through the last dozen joints with the same care and the same attention he had given the first. The final joint was a small X-shaped crossing near the upper right corner, where one of the blue diamonds sat in its amber frame, and the glazier touched the iron to it with a particular gentleness, aware that the blue glass was thin and close to the lead and that too much heat could crack it. The solder flowed perfectly, a tiny round pool that hardened to a smooth grey dome, and the glazier lifted the iron and set it aside on the firebrick. Its work done for the day. The two completed lights lay side by side on the layout bench, their lead joints all soldered and cooled, their glass clean and unbroken, their patterns of green and amber and blue catching the afternoon light. The glazier took a long, slow breath and ran the palm of his hand over the surface of the right light, feeling the slight, even ridges of the soldered joints under his skin. The joints were strong and smooth, none of them sharp or proud, and the panel was now a single solid object rather than a loose arrangement of pieces. It could be lifted by one edge without sagging. It could be carried across the workshop or down the street to the church without coming apart. The glazier did not say any of this to the boy, but the boy understood it anyway, standing beside the bench and looking at the finished lights with a tired, quiet satisfaction that was his own small reflection of his master's deeper, unspoken feeling. The glazier cleaned the soldering iron while the iron was still warm, wiping the copper tip with the leather pad and then with a scrap of oiled wool to prevent rust. And he hung the iron on its hook near the brazier, where it would wait for the next project. The remaining flux was sealed with its cloth, the solder coil was returned to its box, the file was brushed clean of lead dust, and the small table was moved back to its place against the wall. The workshop returned to its normal order, the tools all away, and the benches all clear, except for the two lights of the panel that would now wait, under their covering cloth, for the next step in the long, patient sequence that led from raw glass to finished window. The boys swept the floor around the layout bench, collecting the tiny flakes of lead and the dried crumbs of flux that had fallen during the day, and the glazier banked the coals in the brazier and trimmed the lantern wicks, and the afternoon slowly, quietly, became the early evening. The glazier stood in the doorway for his usual moment, looking out at the street where the light was softening into a cool, pearly dusk, and the first lamps were being lit in the windows of the houses opposite. The smell of cooking smoke drifted from a chimney somewhere nearby, and a dog barked twice, and then was silent. He thought about the work that remained, the cementing of the panel, the cleaning and polishing, the final fitting into the stone tracery at St. Michael the Belfry. Each of these tasks would take its own day, its own set of tools, its own quiet rhythm, and none of them could be skipped or hurried. But the soldering was a threshold, a moment when the separate pieces became a thing, and that moment had now passed, leaving behind only the steady, calm knowledge that the panel was one step closer to the light it was made to carry. The glazier pulled the door shut, turned the key in the lock, and walked home through the mild, fading evening, the sounds of the city settling around him like a blanket being drawn up for the night. The morning set aside for cementing the panel began with the sky that had finally cleared, a pale scrubbed blue that held no clouds and no hint of the earlier grey, and the light that came through the back window of the workshop was sharp and clean, throwing distinct shadows from the tools and the benches and the two completed lights that still lay under their covering cloth on the layout bench. The glazier arrived earlier than usual, having woken before the bells and lain still in his bed for a while, listening to the first birds in the eaves and thinking in a loose, drifting way about the task ahead. Cementing was the messiest part of his craft, the step that left his hands black and his apron stiff in the workshop smelling of linseed oil and lampblack for days afterward. But it was also the step that made a window weatherproof, sealing the tiny gaps between the lead and the glass so that no wind could whistle through and no rain could seep into the channels and freeze and crack the cane in winter. A window that was not properly cemented would rattle in its frame and leak in the first hard downpour, and the glazier had never sent out a window that he had not cemented with his own hands, working the thick grey slurry into every crevice until the panel was as tight as a ship's hull. He began the morning by gathering the ingredients for the cement, a task that the boy Robin would normally assist with, but that he did alone today, the boy having been sent the previous evening to help his mother with a household task that would keep him until after the midday bells. The glazier walked to the back of the workshop, where a row of wooden bins and clay jars stood against the wall under the lean-to, and he opened the bin that held the powdered chalk. The chalk was fine and white, ground from the soft limestone that was quarried in the hills to the east of York, and it puffed up in a small pale cloud when he scooped a measure into a wide, shallow mixing bowl. The measure was a wooden cup that had darkened over time to a deep, oily brown, and he used 4 cupfuls, tipping each one into the bowl with a slow, careful motion that kept the dust from rising too high. Next he added a single cupful of lampblack, the fine, sooty powder that collected in the hoods of oil lamps and that gave the cement its dark, workable color and its added body. And he stirred the 2 dry powders together with a flat wooden paddle, combining them into a uniform pale grey mixture that resembled the ash from a wood fire that had burned all night. The liquid for the cement came from a stoneware jug of boiled linseed oil, which the glazier poured in the thin amber stream, stirring constantly with the paddle as the oil was absorbed by the dry powders. The mixture thickened and darkened, turning from pale grey to a deep, slatty colour, and it gave off a smell that was sharp and warm and slightly sweet, a smell that clung to the inside of the nose and stayed there for hours. The glazier added small amounts of turpentine from a smaller jug as he stirred, thinning the cement to a consistency that was like thick porridge, smooth enough to be worked into the narrow channels of the lead cames, but stiff enough that it would not run out once it was in place. The mixing took a long time, longer than the actual application would take, because the cement had to be completely smooth and free of lumps, each grain of chalk and each speck of lampblack fully incorporated into the oil, and the glazier stirred with a patient circular motion that never varied, watching the surface of the mixture as it became glossy and even under the paddle. When the cement was ready, the glazier carried the mixing bowl to the layout bench and set it beside the left light of the panel, which he had uncovered earlier while the mixture was resting. The panel looked different in the clean morning light, its lead lines dark and matte, its glass glowing with a quiet internal luminosity that the grey skies of the previous days had not revealed. He had placed a thick layer of scraped lambskin under the panel to protect the bench from the oil that would inevitably seep through during the cementing, and he had laid out the tools he would need: a stiff bristle brush made from the hair of a boar, cut short and square at the tip, a stick of soft pine wood sharpened to a flat, chisel-like edge, several squares of coarse linen cloth, and a bucket of fine dry sawdust that he had collected from the carpenter's shop 2 doors down. The sawdust would be used at the end to burnish the glass and absorb any remaining oil from the surface. The glazier put on his heaviest leather apron, the one that was stiff and cracked and permanently dark with old oil stains, and he sat down on a stool beside the bench. He dipped the stiff brush into the cement, working the bristles into the grey slurry until they were fully loaded, and then he began to apply the cement to the first section of the left light. Pressing the brush firmly against the lead came at the junction of the border and the first row of quarries. The cement went on thickly, a dark, greasy line that filled the gap between the lead and the glass and covered the face of the cane itself, and the glazier worked the brush back and forth in short, vigorous strokes that forced the paste down into the H-channel of the cane, where the glass edges sat and where the weather would try to enter. The sound of the brush was a rough, rhythmic scuff that repeated in short bursts. Scuff, 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 then a pause as he dipped the brush again, then scuff, scuff, scuff on the next section, and the pattern rolled across the panel in slow, deliberate waves. The cementing required a certain amount of force, more than any of the previous steps, because the paste had to be driven deep into the channels and the corners. But it was not a violent force. It was the steady, insistent pressure of a man who knew the material and knew that it would yield if he was patient. The glazier worked along every line of lead came, the borders and the interior grid, and the curved arch pieces, covering each one with the dark, oily cement until the entire left light looked as if it had been painted over with a thick, grey-black coating that obscured the glass and the lead alike. The panel at this stage was not beautiful to look at, its colours all hidden under the smeared opaque paste. But the glazier did not mind this temporary ugliness. It was a necessary phase, like the wrapping of a newborn infant in swaddling bands, and it would soon give way to the final, clean result. When the cement had been applied to the entire left light, the glazier set down the brush and picked up the soft pine stick, and he began the second part of the process, which was to press the cement more firmly into the channels and to scrape away the excess. He worked the stick along each lead line, pressing the flat tip into the channel and then drawing it along at a low angle, a motion that packed the cement tightly against the glass edges and left a thin, even film on the surface of the lead. The excess cement collected on the stick in soft dark curls, and he wiped these periodically onto a scrap of old linen, which he would later throw into the brazier because the linseed oil in the cement could heat and smoulder if left in a pile. The scraping made a soft, tacky sound, a sound like a finger drawn across a freshly waxed board, and it required a careful hand to avoid pressing too hard and cracking the glass, or pressing too softly and leaving the cement loose in the channel. The glazier's hand was steady, the pressure even, and the stick moved along the lead lines with a slow, continuous motion that spoke of years of practice. After the pressing and scraping came the first cleaning, which the glazier did with the squares of coarse linen, wiping the surface of the glass in firm circular motions that lifted the smeared cement from the panes without disturbing the paste that was packed into the channels. The linen quickly became black and greasy, and he used many squares, discarding each one as it became saturated and taking a fresh one from the pile. The glass began to emerge from under the grey coating, first in small pale patches that reflected the light, then in larger, clearer areas as the wiping continued, and the green of the quarries and the amber of the fillets and the blue of the corner accents slowly returned to view, their colours now looking deeper and richer against the dark, freshly cemented lead lines. The glazier wiped and wiped, his arm moving in those steady circles, and the workshop was very quiet except for the soft, rhythmic rub of the linen on glass and the distant, intermittent sounds of the street. When the left light was clean to his satisfaction, the glazier moved on to the right light and repeated the entire process, beginning with the application of the cement and moving through the pressing and the scraping and the wiping in the same order and with the same unvarying pace. The morning had now advanced well into the afternoon, and the sun had shifted around to the front of the workshop, sending a bright, warm shaft of light through the open door that fell across the floor and made the dust motes sparkle. The boy Robin would be returning soon, but for now the glazier worked alone, his only company, the lantern flame and the small, muted sounds of his own tools. The second light took less time than the first because the rhythm was now fully established and because the bowl of cement had softened slightly from sitting, making it easier to work into the channels. When the right light was cleaned and its glass was once again visible, the glazier set aside the cloths and the stick and the brush, and he took up the bucket of sawdust. The final polishing with sawdust was a step that the glazier always found quietly satisfying. The step that transformed the panel from a newly cemented, slightly smeary object into a finished, gleaming piece of work. He sprinkled a handful of the fine, pale sawdust over the surface of the left light, spreading it with his palm until it covered the entire panel in a thin, dry layer. And then he began to rub the sawdust into the glass and the lead with a flat, circular motion, using a fresh pad of folded linen. The sawdust absorbed the last traces of oil from the surface of the glass, and it burnished the lead cames to a smooth, dark, matte finish, and it left behind a smell that was clean and woody, a smell that gradually replaced the sharper odor of the linseed oil and turpentine. The boy Robin entered the workshop just as the glazier was brushing the used sawdust from the left light with a soft, wide brush made of badger hair, revealing the panel in its nearly finished state. The glass bright and clear, the lead lines dark and even, the whole composition clean and tight and ready for the final, light touch of the brush that would remove every last speck of dust. The boy stopped just inside the door and looked at the panel, and his tired face showed a flicker of something that was close to wonder, though he would not have called it that. The glazier glanced up, saw the boy standing there, and motioned him towards the bucket of sawdust with a tilt of his head. The boy came forward, took up a second pad of linen, and began to help with the polishing of the right light, and the two of them worked together in the warm, quiet afternoon, rubbing the sawdust into the glass and brushing it away, until both lights of the window panel were as clean and as bright as they would ever be. The cementing was done, and the panel was weatherproof and strong, and only one task remained before the long journey of the work reached its quiet end. The morning of the fitting arrived with a sky of soft, even cloud, a mild overcast that wrapped the city of York in a gentle, diffused light, the kind of light that made every stone and every timber look as if it had been drawn in chalk and then lightly smudged. The glazier had slept well, his sleep untroubled by dreams, and he woke with the quiet, settled feeling of a man who knows that a long task is nearing its end. He ate his usual portion of bread and hard cheese, while standing at the window of his small house, looking out at the rooftops that sloped away towards the river, and he drank a cup of small ale that was cool and faintly sour, and then he put on his felt hat and his mended doublet and walked the familiar route to Stonegate, through streets that were just beginning to stir. The workshop was dim when he opened the door, the lanterns not yet lit, but the two completed lights of the window panel lay on the layout bench where he had left them after the cementing, their surfaces clean and gleaming faintly in the low morning light, the lead lines dark and even, the glass glowing with its own quiet internal color. He stood over them for a moment and looked at them. The green quarries and the amber falaise and the small blue diamonds that marked the corners, and he saw that nothing had shifted, nothing had cracked, nothing had failed during the night. The panel was ready. The boy Robin arrived a short while later, his face still flushed from the cool air outside, and he helped the glazier lift the two lights from the bench and wrap them in layers of soft, clean linen, tucking the cloth around the edges and tying the bundle with flax string so that the glass would be protected during the short walk to the church. The bundle was not heavy, though it was awkward to carry because of its size and its fragility, and the glazier decided that they would carry it together, each holding one end, walking slowly and steadily through the streets. The boy took the front and the glazier took the back, and they stepped out of the workshop into the mild, still morning, the door locking behind them with the familiar clunk of the iron key, and they began their slow progress along Stonegate towards the minster and the parish church of St. Michael Lelfrere. The streets were quiet at this hour, the market stalls still being set up and the shop shutters only half raised, and the few people they passed paid them no particular attention. A glazier carrying a wrapped panel was a common enough sight in a city with as many windows as York, and the bundle gave no hint of the careful, patient work that had gone into its making. The glazier walked with his head slightly bent, watching the cobbles ahead of his feet and adjusting his pace to match the boy's, and the boy walked with the careful, measured steps of someone carrying something precious, his arms rigid and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. They passed the great west front of the minster, its twin towers rising into the pale sky, and they turned into the close where the daisies were now thick on the grass and the sheep had been moved to another pasture. The church of St. Trude, Michael le Belfry, stood as it had stood for centuries, its square bell tower solid and plain, its low porch door open to the morning air. The glazier and the boy carried the bundle through the churchyard gate and up the worn stone path, and they set it down gently on the flankstones of the south porch, while the glazier went inside to find the wardens. The nave was empty and cool, smelling as it always did of beeswax and old stone and the faint, clean scent of the rushes that had been renewed since his last visit. The light from the great east window fell across the chancel steps in a broad silver-white wash, and the smaller windows in the side aisles cast their own patches of muted colour onto the floor, a quiet, dappled pattern that shifted slowly as the clouds moved outside. The glazier walked to the vestry door and knocked lightly, and Master Heron the wax chandler opened it, his round face creasing into a mild, unsurprised smile. The glazier told him that the window panel was ready and waiting in the porch, and Master Heron nodded and called to Thomas Byland, who was inside the vestry sorting through a pile of parish accounts. The three men walked back to the porch together, and the wardens watched as the glazier and the boy unwrapped the linen from the two lights of the panel, revealing the glass and the lead to the daylight for the first time outside the workshop. The green quarries caught the light and held it, glowing with a soft, watery brightness, and the amber fillets framed them in a warm golden border, and the blue diamonds shone like small, quiet stars at the corners. Master Heron let out a low, slow breath, and Thomas Byland tilted his head to one side and said that the window was exactly what the parish had hoped for, plain and honest and well made. The glazier accepted their words with a brief level nod, and then he asked if the scaffolding was still in place. It was, Master Heron told him, and it had been checked and found sound, and the temporary board had been taken down that morning to leave the tracery open and ready. The glazier and the boy carried the first light of the panel into the nave and across to the north aisle, where the scaffolding rose against the wall like a skeleton of rough, dark timber. The boy climbed up first, his feet finding the rungs with the same careful movements he had learned in the workshop, and the glazier handed the panel up to him, light by light, passing each one with slow, deliberate care until both rested safely against the scaffold platform. The glazier then climbed up himself, carrying the satchel of tools and fittings that he would need: a small wooden mallet, a set of thin iron wedges, a coil of lead strip for packing the grooves, and a pot of the same linseed oil potty that he used for sealing the stone joints. The scaffold platform was broad and steady, and from it the glazier could see the whole north aisle laid out below him, the worn flagstones and the memorial brasses and the plain wooden pews that stood in neat, silent rows. He could also see the boy standing below, looking up with his hands clasped behind his back, and he motioned for the boy to come up and help, because the fitting would require 4 hands, and the boy had earned his place on the scaffold. The tracery of the north aisle window was a tall lancet divided into 2 lights by a central stone mullion, and its groove was deep and true, exactly as the glazier had found it when he took his measurements with the knotted string. He examined the groove one final time, running his fingertips along the cool, gritty stone to be sure that no new obstructions had appeared, and he found it clean and ready. He then lifted the left light of the panel and positioned it at the base of the opening, tilting it slightly so that its lower edge slid into the groove, and the boy held it steady from below while the glazier guided the top edge into place. The panel settled into the stone with a soft, dull thud, the lead edges catching the groove and holding firm, and the glazier tapped the panel gently with the wooden mallet, nudging it into perfect alignment. He inserted the thin iron wedges at intervals along the edge, tapping each one in just far enough to hold the glass steady without stressing the lead. And then he packed the remaining space in the groove with the coils of lead strip, pressing the soft metal into the gaps with the tip of a wooden spatula until the panel was seated as firmly as if it had grown there. The right light followed, fitting into its side of the tracery with the same process and the same quiet, careful tapping, and when both lights were in place, the glazier stood back on the scaffold platform and looked at the window as a whole. The 2 lights filled the stone opening exactly, the central mullion dividing them with a clean vertical line, and the small trefoil opening above, which had been left empty because it had never been part of the commission, let in a patch of plain pale sky that balanced the coloured glass below. The glazier then applied the linseed oil putty to the outer edges of the groove, sealing the tiny gap between the lead and the stone with a smooth, even bead that would harden over time and keep the weather out, and he smoothed the putty with a wet finger until it was flush and neat. The fitting was complete. The glazier climbed down from the scaffolding, and the boy followed, and the 2 of them stood in the north aisle looking up at the window they had made. The morning light, now nearing the middle of the day, was passing through the green quarries and casting a soft, greenish wash onto the flagstones below, a patch of cool, watery colour that shifted and rippled as the light outside waxed and waned with the passage of the invisible clouds. The amber border fillets threw their own warmer, golden light onto the edges of the pool, and the blue diamonds at the corners sent small, concentrated dots of cool colour that seemed to float on the surface of the stone. The window was quiet and unassuming, a simple grid of diamonds with no figures and no emblems and no text, and yet it had the calm, complete presence of a thing made well and placed rightly. The glazier stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the light on the floor, and he felt the same quiet satisfaction that he always felt at the end of a project. A feeling that was too mild and too deep to be called pride. Master Heron and Thomas Byland came to stand beside him, their footsteps soft on the flagstones, and they looked at the window and at the coloured light on the floor. And Master Heron said that the parish would remember the glazier's work in their prayers, not with names or with images, but in the simple, ongoing way that a parish remembered all the things that served its life. The glazier thanked him with a brief, quiet word, and then he and the boy gathered the wrapping cloths and the tools and the empty satchel, and they walked back down the nave and out through the south porch into the mild, overcast afternoon. The churchyard was empty now, the daisies closed against the grey light, and the rooks were silent in the elms. The glazier and the boy walked back along Stonegate to the workshop, where the boy would sweep the floor one last time, and the glazier would return the tools to their pegs and the surplus glass to its rack, and then they would part for the evening, the boy to his mother's house, and the glazier to his own quiet rooms. When the workshop was tidy, and the lantern trimmed and the door locked for the night, the glazier stood for a moment on the street, looking up at the sky which was now darkening towards a soft grey dusk. Somewhere behind the rooftops the new window in the north aisle of St. Tin, Michael the belfry was settling into its stone frame, cooling in the evening air, its leaden glass already beginning the long patient work of holding the light and keeping out the weather. The glazier pulled his hat lower on his brow and turned towards home, walking slowly through the quiet streets, and behind him the window took its place among the other windows of the city, a small calm point of colour in the vast unfolding darkness of the English night.